There is a rhythm to history that feels like the creak of a ship's timbers or the steady beat of hooves along a road, and the 100 Years' War begins in that rhythm, with tensions, alliances, old grievances, and the slow tightening of diplomatic knots. Two crowns, two cultures, and one patchwork of loyalties in France set the stage for a conflict that would last generations. You can hear it in the names and places: Aquitaine, Gascony, Flanders, Calais, regions whose economies and identities braided together, and which would tug the two kingdoms toward war. Most stayed silent while kingdoms pulled their people toward war. Subscribe if you have had the courage to choose, to stand, to fight. Long before the banners unfurled in earnest, there were reasons large and small that pushed England and France into rivalry. Dynastic claims, always the loudest of ancient arguments, were complicated by marriages and legal traditions. When Edward III of England staked a claim on the French throne through his mother, Isabella, he was drawing a line in a world that did not like lines. The French invoked customs that barred succession through women, and the scene was set for dispute. Economic stitches held the two realms tightly together, and they could be pulled apart by a single tug. English wool made Flemish cloth. Flemish cities depended on that cloth trade, and control of ports and markets mattered as much as who held the title. English possessions in southwestern France, known broadly as Aquitaine or Gascony, were also a source of revenue, pride, and constant friction, because they were lands the English duke administered while simultaneously serving as a vassal to the French king. So the arguments were not only about who wore a crown. They were about customs duties, about local lordships that switched allegiances like weather vanes, about merchants who fretted over access to ports, and about local sentiments that could be coaxed into revolt or harnessed into an army. The 100 Years' War began in 1337 as more than a dynastic dispute. It was a series of interconnected crises that made conflict look inevitable. And when war started, it did not arrive as a single thunderclap. It came in shoves and forays, naval clashes, sieges, and raids into the countryside. The early years showed a pattern that would repeat. English strategy relied on mobility, on well-timed coastal raids known as chevauchées, and on naval strength to move men and supplies. Edward III was patient and deliberate, sometimes choosing to avoid pitched battle until conditions favored him. He also understood the importance of the sea, and one of the earliest decisive moments came not on a field but on the Channel itself. In June of 1340, the English fleet met the French at Sluys, and the encounter was more than a naval victory. It was a moment that shaped how England waged war across the Channel. Edward's fleet encountered the French anchored in a narrow strait, and the English seized the tactical advantage. They fought at close quarters, boarding enemy ships and turning the sea into a platform for hand-to-hand combat. And when the smoke cleared, the French fleet lay shattered and unable to contest English control of the Channel for years to come. That control mattered in a concrete way. With the Channel open, Edward could move troops and supplies with a confidence he had not possessed before. He would use that freedom 5 years later to land an army on the French coast and begin an audacious campaign that would culminate in one of the most famous battles of the medieval era. But the path to Crécy was not a straight march. It was paved with scouts, foraging columns, sieges, and calculated provocations intended to draw the French into a fight on English terms. The summer campaign of 1346 began with a landing at the port of St. Vaast, a bold operation that required planning and a fleet to match. Edward landed thousands of men and horses, a force meant to hurt French commerce and to inspire allies in Flanders and elsewhere to rise against Philip VI. From there the English moved inland, a line of banners and wagons marching through a land that had not been the scene of a prolonged foreign army in decades. As they marched south and east through a landscape of villages, crops, hedgerows, and small woods, the English employed a brutal calculus familiar to medieval warfare, the chevauchée. These mounted raids smashed harvests, burned mills, and took what they needed, all while avoiding the long, grinding business of sieges when possible. It was warfare designed to undermine the enemy's ability and will to resist by making the cost of continued resistance unbearable to the local economy and to the king's purse. Philip VI reacted as any king might when an invading army was ravaging his territories. He mustered a host drawn from his own feudal hierarchy and from France's regional powers. French chivalry, with its mounted knights and proud banners, coalesced into a force determined to drive the invaders back. The French army was larger on paper and rich with nobility, yet size alone would not be the deciding factor when terrain and tactics favored quality of position and discipline. By late August, the two hosts found themselves near the Somme, a landscape of rivers, marshes, and patchwork farmland that would shape what happened next. Edward's army, weary from marches and anxious to find a defensible stance, took positions near the village of Crécy and Agincourt. The hour was late, and a storm had swept through the area, making the air thick and the ground damp. These weather details mattered because they would play into the strengths and weaknesses of the troops arrayed against one another. Edward chose his ground with purpose. He placed his men on a slight rise with a narrow approach, backed by hedgerows and small lanes that would funnel any attackers into killing zones. The English were not simply relying on earthworks, they used sharpened stakes planted at an angle to throw charging horses off balance. Dismounted men-at-arms took positions with archers arrayed ahead of them, forming a layered defense that turned the slope into a fortress of bodies and arrows. The English army itself was a mixture of elements. There were armored men-at-arms who fought on foot as well as on horseback, and there were archers, the longbowmen, who would come to define this engagement. The longbow was a weapon that required years of practice. Drawn on the longbow's backs were centuries of English training. Skilled archers could loose arrows in rapid succession, shaping the battlefield like a smith shaping iron. Opposing them, the French boasted knights whose identity and status were bound up in mounted combat and shock charges that had carried armor-clad youth to glory for centuries. The French plan leaned on their cavalry to break the English positions with repeated charges, while contingents of Genoese crossbowmen were expected to provide missile support. The French command, confident and perhaps a touch complacent in its numerical strength, ordered a series of actions that soon betrayed a lack of coordination. There is an image of the battlefield worth holding: the English archers in their ranks, their leather caps tipped by rain, their gloves adjusted, their arrows knocked in a rhythm that would become the heartbeat of their defense. The Genoese crossbowmen, professional soldiers from Italy hired into French service, advanced first at the French command's direction. They were valuable and experienced, but crossbows demanded time to reload and their strings were vulnerable to moisture. The weather had been unkind to the Genoese. A downpour and gusts of damp wind had slackened the silk and hemp cords of their crossbows, making them lose tension and ruin their range. Meanwhile, the longbow, made of yew and suited to quick, repeated firing, continued to send volleys of arrows in rapid staccato towards the Genoese line. The result was a collision in effect. A unit trained for a different set of conditions found itself outmatched and outpaced by an English missile force that was both rapid and well-positioned. As the Genoese faltered, the French cavalry moved forward with the kind of resolute fury that had broken gates in earlier decades. Knights in gleaming armor urged their horses through mud and hedgerow, trusting that their weight and lances could cut through the English line. Yet the ground was not kind. The English stakes did their grim work, and above it all the air was full of a whistling that came from thousands of arrows. The physicality of those passages is hard to overstate when you try to imagine them. Horses, armored or not, do not fare well when presented with a forest of sharpened timber and a storm of slender, fast-flying projectiles. Riders tumbled, lances splintered. Knights who had once thought of themselves as nearly invulnerable found their horses brought down and their momentum broken. The English ranks, disciplined and dug in, drew the French into attrition rather than glory. Command and control on a medieval battlefield were never precise, and at Crécy they were frayed. Orders were shouted across the sodden fields and were often misheard, misunderstood, or simply impossible to execute given the churned earth and the press of men. French nobles, eager to prove themselves or to cover the retreat of others, led charges that lacked the coordinated support needed to succeed. What began as a grand assault turned into repeated attacks that were each weakened more than the last. One of the striking elements of the day was the fate of notable figures who, in trying to follow the rules of chivalry, found themselves in a very different kind of war. Joan of Bohemia, a blind king who fought with the sword at his side and tied himself to his horse because he could not see the course of battle, rode into the fray and was killed. His death became a storied image of medieval courage and tragedy, and it also symbolized the human cost of a clash between ideals and reality. What carried the day for the English was not merely the misfortune of the French or the damp of a single afternoon. It was a convergence of preparation, position, and weaponry. Edward's decision to fight on ground of his choosing, to stake out an anchoring elevation, and to trust a mixed force of men-at-arms and longbowmen turned the mathematics of size on its head. The longbowmen's discipline and steady, deliberate volleys translated their practice into an industrial output of missiles that decimated the charges against them. The French cavalry did not fail for lack of bravery, but because their bravery collided with a radically efficient defensive system. Each charge exhausted more of the horseflesh and more of the noble impulse. Each repulse diminished the French capacity to coordinate a final, decisive breakthrough. By late afternoon, the battlefield belonged to the English, who moved forward among the wounded and the dead with a grim, procedural calm, tallying prisoners and distributing ransoms. Victories in medieval warfare were not merely about lines on a map, they were also theatrical events that created reputations. Crécy made Edward III a king who could win on foreign soil, but it also elevated the image of English arms and placed longbowmen in the center of military thinking. Tales of the day, of arrows turning the air black and of knights dismounted and overwhelmed, would be repeated at courts and hearths for years, shaping how future commanders thought about armor, cavalry, and missile troops. The aftermath of Crécy had immediate and long-term consequences. In the short term, it allowed Edward to advance toward Calais, a port that would become a jewel in English hands after a siege that followed the battle. Calais offered a strategic base on the continent, an entrepot for English trade, and a permanent foothold that would complicate French efforts for generations. The English turn of events after Crécy showed that a single well-executed victory could produce geopolitical consequences far beyond the ground trampled the day before. But there were subtler ripples as well. The battle challenged the romantic image of chivalric warfare, exposing the limits of a culture that prized mounted heroism above practical survivability. Armies and rulers began to think more about combined arms, about the interaction of missile troops and dismounted heavy infantry, and about fortifications that could withstand sieges fed by well-supplied ports. Warfare became more technological and organizational. It moved away from pure spectacle toward an engineering of victory. Crécy also taught lessons about logistics and preparation. The English supply train had been efficient enough to keep men fed and arrows supplied, and that mundane fact had tactical consequences. Longbows require not only skill but also a steady supply of arrows and the materials to maintain them. The English administration, often grumbled about in peacetime, showed an ability to sustain military operations at some distance from home. The battle highlighted the role of contingency, weather, miscommunication, the particular character of a day's fighting, in deciding the fates of kingdoms. If the Genoese straps had not lost tension, or if the French cavalry had found firmer ground for its charge, the day might have ended differently. History, in that sense, is a dialogue between plan and chance, and Crécy is a paragraph in that larger conversation where the unexpected asserted itself with a clarity that stunned contemporaries. For the French nobility, the catastrophe at Crécy demanded reflection and, eventually, reform. If a generation of knights could be cut down or captured by archers on hedgerow-lined fields, then the social assumption that knightly cavalry would always dominate needed reconsideration. Over time, this would influence military recruitment, armor design, and the practice of combined forces, as commanders sought to blend the strengths of missile troops, cavalry, and dismounted men-at-arms in new configurations. On the English side, the victory fed into a growing sense of confidence that would carry through the early stages of the war. But confidence can be a double-edged sword in politics and war alike, raising expectations that require continuous success to sustain. Edward's reputation as a battlefield commander was burnished at Crécy, and that reputation would be both an asset and a burden in the years that followed, shaping alliances and the ambitions of men around him. The immediate human consequences were brutal and intimate. Families lost sons, households lost lords, and towns that had once been centers of commerce hosted the wounded and buried the dead. Ransoms provided an economic logic to the capture of nobles, turning prisoners into sources of wealth and negotiation rather than merely bodies to be taken from the field. This transactional cruelty became part of the war's economy, balancing the chivalric with the mercantile. Yet the battle's story is not confined to that single day. It threads back through months of campaigning and forward into sieges and negotiations. After Crécy, the English turned to Calais, and a year later the town would capitulate, giving Edward a fortified harbor and a platform for future operations. The capture of Calais anchored the English presence on the continent and underscored how land victories and maritime dominance could be mutually reinforcing. In the years after Crécy, chroniclers and poets composed their versions of the battle, and those narratives shaped memory even as the material facts remained complex. Some told of miraculous arrows and divine favor, others of mismanagement and bungled commands. The multiplicity of accounts reminds us that history is also a contest of storytelling, where facts and meaning are woven together into narratives that comfort, explain, and sometimes deceive. Military historians would later see Crécy as part of a broader transition from feudal levies toward more organized, professional forces. The longbowmen were not simply peasants with cheap arms, they were trained specialists who required time to develop their skill and the social framework to sustain it. Recruiting, training, and equipping such men implied changes in taxation, in royal authority, and in how states thought about their martial obligations. The political aftershocks of English victories extended into France's internal dynamics. The loss at Crécy weakened confidence in Philip VI and his court, exposing fractures between the king and his magnates. When a monarch's military reputation is damaged, the ripples spread to diplomacy, internal governance, and the morale of those who must obey or resist him. Europe took notice of the vulnerabilities of even the most ancient crowns. Crécy reshaped how pitched battles were approached, but it did not bring a simple end to mounted heroics or to knightly valor. Instead, it pushed military leaders to consider diversity in forces and the tactical interplay between different troop types. Armies that learned could adapt; those that refused to change often paid a harsh price. The interplay between tradition and innovation is one of the recurrent themes in the war's early decades. The siege of Calais that followed showed Edward's strategic patience. Rather than press deeper into France immediately, he secured a supply base and bargaining chip. The town's resistance and eventual surrender in 1347 meant that England had a continental stronghold long enough to trade, negotiate, and compel concessions. Control of Calais also represented a psychological victory. It was, for the English, a toe firmly lodged in French soil. Beyond Calais, the broader first phase of the 100 Years' War saw a string of English successes that were not always as neat as wins at Crécy. Some sieges dragged, some raids misfired, and politics at home complicated the ability to wage sustained campaigns. Yet the pattern of naval strength, strategic landings, and the effective use of archery marked the early English approach and helped explain its early successes. It is tempting to view Crécy as a sudden revolution in warfare, but it was also a culmination of gradual adaptations. The longbow had been honed in practices and laws that mandated archery training in England, and in social habits that made shooting a common skill in many regions. What was revolutionary was the scale at which that skill was brought to bear in a defensive formation on European soil and the way it shattered certain assumptions. Technologically and tactically, the battle foreshadowed later developments that would refashion the medieval battlefield. Plate armor would grow thicker in response to missile threats, while infantry formations would become more organized and capable of resisting cavalry. Siege warfare would lean on better artillery over time, and royal bureaucracies would expand to pay for the forces they wished to field. A single battle does not create such shifts, but Crécy was a clear moment of recognition. Socially, the war produced effects at home as men returned not only with ransoms and spoils but with experiences that changed their expectations. Soldiers came back with practical knowledge of logistics, with ideas about the worth of discipline and training, and sometimes with a taste for profit that influenced their local communities. War was expensive in coin and in lives, and the necessities of funding campaigns pushed kings to negotiate new forms of taxation and consent. The English Parliament, already a developing institution, found its role amplified as the Crown sought subsidies to continue continental campaigns. Representatives of shires and boroughs began to weigh the costs of war against local burdens more directly. The need for resources to pay archers' wages, to build and outfit galleys, and to maintain garrison towns like Calais meant that warfare and governance were increasingly intertwined. On the French side, the pressure to reform military practice was matched by a need to address the kingdom's financial and administrative weaknesses. The king's authority was tested by the nobility's capacity to resist new taxes and by the strain of provisioning arms and men for continued conflict. The logistical effort to engine a national war began to reveal the limits of medieval royal administration and the need for innovation in raising and sustaining armies. Yet even as Crécy hung heavy on memory, warfare remained a seasonally dictated business. Campaigns were planned around harvests and the weather, and the best-laid plans could be undone by a cold snap or a soggy field. The English mastery of naval movement gave them more leeway to choose when to bring conflict ashore, but once men were engaged, chance was still an ungoverned variable. Tactical study of the battle reveals little lessons in how to combine force and court calculation. The English did not simply wait passively. Edward exploited the environment and used his smaller force's flexibility to its advantage. He employed scouts and secured communications so that his men could hold positions rather than be lured into the French ideal of a glorious cavalry charge that would win honor rather than strategically useful ground. The intersection of class and capability was visible on the field. Noble knights still provided command and were often frontline leaders who could inspire, but the mass of the fighting descended into the work of specialist artisans, archers, crossbowmen, shieldmen, each playing a technical role. War, in that sense, began to look more like manufacturing than ritual. Success required organization, repetition, and supply chains. Memory kept the glamour of knights even as practicality reshaped their role. The cultural image of chivalry did not dissolve after a single battle, but it became a tension, a set of expectations to be reconciled with the hard arithmetic of survival in an age of new weapons. Literature, courtly romances, and chronicles continued to celebrate knightly deeds even as the longbowman quietly demonstrated his lethal worth. International reaction to the early English victories was varied. Some continental powers reassessed their alliances, considering whether Philip VI was a reliable partner or whether England might offer a better bargain. The Flemish cities cheered when English arms threatened French control because their economic lifeblood depended on English wool. Yet other courts watched with caution, mindful that a powerful and emboldened England on the continent could become a dangerous neighbor. Even now, the sound of Crécy echoes in the materials of later conflict. When historians examine how medieval states waged war, they point to that day as a pivot, a demonstration of how technology, leadership, and terrain could overturn assumptions. But Crécy is not a single, clean lesson. It is a nexus of cause and effect that only makes sense when woven back into the campaigns, politics, and economies of the age. To follow the campaign after the battle is to understand how war is both violent and bureaucratic, spectacular and administrative. Edward's men did not pack up and vanish. They garrisoned, they negotiated ransoms, they consolidated control where they could. The capture of Calais the following year was partly a military triumph and partly the fruit of a careful exploitation of victory, an exercise in applying force and then translating it into political advantage. And yet, for every English triumph there was a cost. Men, money, and patience were expended in brutal measures. The English crown had to raise funds, recruit men, and maintain a presence across the Channel, all while dealing with tensions at home. War at distance is an expensive, precarious business. Victories like Crécy provided openings, but they did not end the struggle. The first phase of the 100 Years' War, with Crécy as a centerpiece, is instructive because it shows how tactical brilliance and careful preparation can produce outsized results. But it also shows how contingencies, wet strings, churned fields, missed orders, shape outcomes as much as any general's plan. This complexity is the human element of military history. Plans meet people, and people are messy and unpredictable. If you stand back and look at the larger sweep, the early English victories reveal a nascent modernity in warfare. The use of specialized troops, the emphasis on logistics and supply, and the integration of land and naval operations suggested a shift toward more state-directed forms of conflict. Yet this modernity was not neat or linear. It emerged amid continuity, where medieval social structures coexisted with innovations in arms and administration. The stories that survived from Crécy often focus on individual episodes: a king who refused to yield, a young prince who fought like a veteran, a blind monarch who chose death over captivity. These human anecdotes are how people make sense of the noise and chaos of battle, and they are how a society preserves courage and memory. But beyond the anecdotes lies a landscape of policy, taxation, and military reform that made the memory possible and turned it into lasting influence. The impact of Crécy also filtered into art and literature. Tapestries and chronicles relayed images of the battle, shaping popular understandings for generations. These cultural artifacts did not simply record facts, they framed meaning, deciding which actions were heroic and which were catastrophic. In so doing, they contributed to a historical narrative that colored later judgments about the nature of chivalry and the evolution of warfare. One should also consider the perspective of common people, who bore the brunt of the chevauchées and sieges that characterized the period. For villagers and townsfolk, war meant burned fields, lost cattle, and the terror of marauding bands. Their lives, often absent from celebratory histories, were the raw materials upon which noble endeavors were conducted. The economic and human cost of campaigns like the one that led to Crécy was immense and often invisible to those writing the chronicles. When modern readers or listeners contemplate Crécy in the first phase, it's useful to remember that the war was not continuous fighting but a long rhythm of campaigns and pauses. Seasons mattered, as did harvests and the time needed to gather men and money. Diplomacy continued through the war's first decades, punctuated by violent eruptions that themselves were shaped by long-term political trends and short-term tactical choices. The techniques of archery deserve a closer look because they were so influential at Crécy. A well-made longbow could fire arrows with sufficient velocity to penetrate armor at close ranges, and its builders and users developed an entire ecosystem of fletching, arrowhead design, and target practice. The speed of fire distinguished it from the crossbow. Though a crossbow could pack a punch, its slower rate of fire became a liability when facing a disciplined volleying line of longbowmen. Similarly, the nature of armor was evolving. Plate elements were being added to the older mail shirts, and helmets improved in form and coverage. But armor is always a compromise between protection and weight. Heavier plate could save a knight's life but also encumber him. At Crécy, the intersection of missile technology and defensive kit revealed how these compromises could have fatal consequences when combined with unfavorable ground and determined tactics. The political calculus of ransom and capture shaped the day-to-day decisions of noble commanders. A captured noble could be legally and politically valuable, offering a chance to raise funds and to manipulate rival lineages through negotiated freedom. This commercial aspect of war made capture sometimes preferable to slaughter, adding a grimly rational element to the mayhem of battle. The English also learned from their own experiences, adjusting tactics and administrative measures in response to both victories and near misses. The early parts of the 100 Years' War were an extended experiment in how an island kingdom could project power across a narrow sea against a larger land-based neighbor. Some experiments failed, others succeeded spectacularly, and the lessons from Crécy were filed and reused in subsequent campaigns. International perceptions of the conflict shifted as stories of English battlefield competence circulated. Allies and enemies recalculated their own positions, mercenaries priced their services differently, and the reputations of commanders rose and fell in parallel with their success. The modern sense that reputations can be strategic assets has roots in moments like Crécy, where a single day amplified the prestige of a leader across courts and markets. We should also consider the psychological impact on combatants. Men who faced such a torrent of arrows and then survived were deeply changed by the experience. Fear, exhilaration, trauma, and a new appreciation for the fragility of status colored the memories of those who returned home. Veterans carried tales that became part of local lore, influencing how communities thought about honor, duty, and the costs of serving a distant crown. The immediate theater of war around Crécy involved more than troops on a field. It involved spies, scouts, and informants who helped shape decisions by relaying news of enemy movement. Intelligence in the medieval context was often ad hoc but could be decisive. Scouts' reports about the French disposition or about the state of the roads could determine whether a commander chose to stand or to withdraw. In that sense, the campaign was as much about information as about steel and arrows. Finally, the first phase of the 100 Years' War, with its early English victories and the drama of Crécy, demonstrates how military events are embedded in a tapestry of social, economic, and political threads. A battle is not a single thread, it is the knot that binds many lines together and that reveals the larger fabric when you pull on it. Hearing the story of Crécy is to listen to a historical chorus where courage, chance, policy, and human frailty all sing simultaneously. And so the memory of Crécy endures, not only because of its spectacle but because it altered how wars were fought and how rulers thought about force. The English longbowmen, the damp fields, the French cavalry, and the strategic calculations of a king meeting weather and wood, these things together created more than a moment, they created a turning point. As you listen and perhaps picture the gray skies over Ponthieu, consider how one day's choices and one day's luck lodged themselves into the centuries that followed. Even after the smoke of Crécy cleared, the 100 Years' War would continue to twist and turn for decades, returning again and again to themes of claim, commerce, and complexity. Edward's early victories were decisive in their time, but they did not put an end to the war's underlying causes. Instead, they opened new chapters, some triumphant and some tragic, and they taught Europe that the face of warfare was changing. The long shadow of those early years reaches into later transformations, changes in the composition of armies, the growth of royal bureaucracies, and the establishment of fortified bases on foreign soil. These changes were incremental but cumulative, and together they remade the tools and institutions of medieval power. Crécy sits in the middle of that story as an event that accelerated tendencies already present and that gave concrete form to abstract developments. Listening to the history of the first phase is to hear a balance between grand strategy and minute detail. You can trace diplomatic cables, so to speak, between courts and merchants, and you can also follow the worn pathways of soldiers' boots through fields and lanes. Both registers matter, because the policies negotiated in halls depend on what can be enforced on roads and in hedgerows. Most only watch history, a few live it. Subscribe if you dare to walk the soldier's path and test the policies written in palaces. There are lessons about humility for rulers in the story. Confidence can become overreach, and success can breed complacency. The French court found that its traditional methods were suddenly vulnerable, and the English crown learned that the costs of maintaining advantage are high and relentless. The importance of money, discipline, and the ability to adapt were all illustrated by the actions surrounding Crécy and its aftermath. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers would pick and choose which parts of the story to amplify. Some recited the heroics of kings, others focused on the suffering of commoners. Yet a thorough reading shows that neither perspective alone captures the whole truth. The war was an ecosystem of motives and outcomes where military technique, economic interest, and human emotion mixed in a volatile brew. The first phase, then, is not a neat prelude but a foundational act. It shaped the way subsequent generations thought about sovereignty, military organization, and the relationship between ruler and subject. The victories of Edward and his commanders were real and consequential, but they were also the product of accumulated practice, favorable circumstances, and the stubborn capacity of men to keep fighting despite hardship. As the war moved forward, the lessons of Crécy would be reinterpreted and repurposed by commanders who sought advantage. New combinations of arms would arise, and new political coalitions would form and dissipate. The experience of the early decades taught European states that warfare was an enterprise requiring steady management and the ability to think in terms of supply lines, diplomacy, and multi-year commitments. If you are driving and imagining those fields and banners, remember that medieval warfare was not simply a display of brute force. It was an argument about who could better use knowledge, technology, and organization to achieve political ends. Crécy stands as an argument that preparation, combined arms, and the wise choice of ground can outweigh numbers and reputation. It is a lesson in the limits of tradition when tradition meets an enemy who has adapted. Above all, the first phase of the 100 Years' War teaches the listener how fragile assumptions can be when confronted with new realities. Knights could still be brave, kings could still be dignified, but the longbowmen in their simple garb altered the calculus of battle. War is always about adaptation, and Crécy is an emblem of a moment when adaptation triumphed in a way that reverberated across the continent. The story of Crécy is also a story of consequence, where a tactical victory fed into strategic advantage and into longer-term political positions. The capture of Calais alone shows how battlefield success can be translated into geopolitical leverage. And yet every advantage required administration, defense, and a willingness to pay the price of occupation, which proved as demanding as winning the field itself. In the end, the first phase was a chapter of dynamic motion, of raids and sieges, of sea battles and hedgerow fights, and of leaders learning to marshal resources for long campaigns. No single event ended the matter, but events like Crécy pivoted the war's trajectory. The rhythms of supply and the noises of the longbow wove themselves into Europe's evolving military tapestry. When you put on this story while driving through a landscape of modern roads and fields, it's worth remembering that those same roads once guided armored men and archers, and that the settlements you pass might have felt the tremors of cavalry 1,000 years ago. The world of the 100 Years' War is both remote and proximate. Its lessons about statecraft, adaptation, and the cost of force remain surprisingly modern. And so the tale of the first phase closes not with a final trumpeting but with a continuing cadence. Crécy is a chapter marked by arrow-strewn skies and the resolute decisions of leaders who understood the limits and possibilities of their time. It is a story of change born of necessity and chance, a reminder that in war, as in life, the interplay of skill, luck, and character writes the pages we remember. The 100 Years' War is a name that compresses a vast sweep of history into a single phrase, but that phrase hides a twisting, intermittent conflict that stretched across generations and reshaped medieval Europe. It began as a tangled dispute over dynastic rights and feudal obligations, yet it quickly became something broader, a crucible of military innovation, economic strain, and emerging national identity. Across more than a century of fighting, fortunes rose and fell like tides, and at the center of several of the war's brightest and darkest moments stood a man known to history as the Black Prince. His life and campaigns illuminate the shifting strategies, the personal ambitions, and the human toll of a war that often turned slaughter into statecraft and vice versa. To understand how the 100 Years' War began, you have to step back to a medieval world where loyalties were layered and titles carried double meanings. The English crown held territories in southwestern France, the remnants of a once expansive Angevin inheritance, and those holdings brought English kings into complex relationships with French overlords. When King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, the issue of succession opened like a fissure, and Edward III of England, who had a blood tie through his mother, pressed a claim. The French nobles, however, invoked a succession custom that excluded inheritance through the female line and raised Philip VI to the throne, setting the stage for a prolonged contest. Economic factors encouraged war as much as dynastic pride. Gascony, the English-held duchy in southwestern France, provided wool and wine and was a linchpin of English trade with the continent. The Flemish towns, reliant on English wool for their cloth industries, looked to England for support against France's attempts to draw them into a French orbit. So what might have been a courtly dispute soon became a fight over markets, ports, and customs duties, and merchants on both sides found themselves with stakes as high as those of any king. The early phase of the war showed a dramatic shift in how armies operated. Traditional knightly charges, the image of armored cavalry sweeping the field, met a new reality: disciplined infantry armed with the English longbow, tight formations, and careful preparation. At the Battle of Sluis in 1340, England established naval supremacy in the Channel, and 2 years later, at Crécy in 1346, a smaller English force used entrenchment and arrow fire to rout a vastly larger French army. Those victories were not just tactical triumphs. There were signs that the medieval battlefield was changing, that massed infantry and technology could blunt the dominance of mounted knights. Edward III's successes culminated in the capture of the port of Calais after a long siege, and Calais became a permanent English foothold on the continent. Calais served as a base for military operations and a commercial hub, symbolizing England's reach into French affairs. Yet even as England seemed ascended, a darker shadow swept Europe. The Black Death arrived in the late 1340s and devastated populations, economies, and the ranks of armies. This plague altered manpower calculations, disrupted feudal obligations, and introduced a new layer of uncertainty into any campaign planning. Out of this disrupted order came Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, who would be remembered as the Black Prince. Born into privilege and martial expectation, he took to war with a mixture of chivalric elan and ruthless efficiency. At Crécy he showed early courage, leading men under heavy fire, but it was in the mid-1350s that his reputation hardened. His chevauchés, fast, mounted raids designed to pillage, terrorize, and draw battle, became a hallmark of English strategy, a way of waging war that focused on material damage and psychological pressure rather than protracted sieges. In 1355, the Black Prince crossed into southwestern France, conducting a campaign that moved like a storm through territories loyal to the French crown. He avoided pitched battle where he did not have advantage and instead sought to strip the countryside of value, deprive the French of supplies, and force a decisive engagement on his own terms. The following year, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, he achieved the kind of victory that reshaped politics. The English captured the French king, John II, along with much of the French nobility. The capture sent shockwaves through France, opened the way to negotiations, and intensified the role of ransom in medieval warfare. The ransom of King John II became a central thread in the aftermath of Poitiers. Medieval kingship was tied to honor, and the custom of generous ransoms often meant a captured monarch could return to power after paying a price. The treaty that followed, the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, fixed terms that seemed to reward English prowess. Lands were ceded, and Edward III was granted expanded control in Aquitaine. For a brief period it appeared that the English crown might convert military triumph into territorial permanence, and the Black Prince's star seemed to shine uncontested. But victory proved brittle. Maintaining territorial gains demanded fiscal burdens that strained the English state and starved ordinary people. The Black Prince, as governor of Aquitaine, found himself charged with defending an embattled realm, administering justice, and raising revenues. His administration was efficient but often heavy-handed. Wine and wool taxes, the impressments of soldiers, and economic exactions bred resentment among Gascon nobles and towns. The prince's fame as a warrior collided with the realities of governance, and where chivalry had once won hearts it increasingly drew ire. During this period the Black Prince's personal life intersected with larger European politics. In the 1360s he became embroiled in Iberian affairs, backing Pedro the Cruel of Castile against a coalition led by Henry of Trastamara. In 1367 he won a resounding victory at the Battle of Najera, restoring Pedro to the throne, but his decision to involve himself in dynastic quarrels across the Pyrenees cost money and men. The campaign showed both his tactical skill and the limits of extending military might at great distance, for the rewards did not match the costs, and the episode strained English resources further. Back in France, the momentum shifted as French commanders adapted and reorganized. The French turned to new tactics that emphasized attrition and avoidance of open battle when it favored the English. Skilled leaders like Bertrand du Guesclin, who rose from relative obscurity, perfected a strategy of small-scale operations, sieges, and harassment that steadily chipped away at English-held territories. These approaches, combined with the waning of English resources and the political exhaustion of Edward III court, allowed the French crown to reclaim ground in the 1370s. The Black Prince's health and fortunes declined alongside England's strategic position. A combination of illness, often described as a wasting disease, possibly dysentery or a related ailment, and the weight of years in the field left him fragile. He retired from active campaigning and died in 1376, a year before his father Edward III. His death left his son, the young Richard II, as heir, but it also marked a turning point. The charismatic martial leader who had symbolized England's apex in the war was gone, and the English position in France would never be the same. After the Black Prince's death, the conflict fragmented into intermittent bouts of fighting and uneasy truces. Charles V of France, known as Charles the Wise, methodically eroded English holdings through well-planned campaigns and a cautious strategy that exploited local weaknesses. He avoided the confrontations that had once favored England and instead worked the seams of power, reclaiming towns and strengthening royal administration. The result was a reversal of the gains of the earlier decades and a slow reclamation of French sovereignty over much of the contested territory. Yet the war did not end with Charles V's gains. Rather, it entered a new, even more turbulent phase. The turn of the 15th century brought fresh English vigor under Henry V, a king who combined ruthless discipline with strategic acuity. Henry invaded France in 1415 and won an astonishing victory at Agincourt, where longbows and muddy ground turned a French numerical superiority into disaster. His campaigns would lead to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, an agreement that disinherited the Dauphin and recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne, a moment that threatened to fuse the two crowns into one. But the promise of Anglo-French union collapsed under the weight of fate and politics. Henry V died in 1422, leaving an infant son, Henry VI, as king of both realms on paper but not in practice. The French resistance coalesced under native leadership and unusual figures, most famously a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who burst onto the scene in 1429 with striking claims of divine guidance. She lifted the siege of Orleans and escorted Charles VII to his coronation, reinvigorating French morale and legitimacy in a way that devices and treaties could not. Joan's capture, trial, and execution in 1431 made her a martyr and fueled a new intensity in French resistance. Meanwhile, the English grip on Normandy and other territories weakened under the strain of expended resources, mercenary unrest, and a lack of sustained political will back home. The war staggered on until the climactic series of battles and sieges in the mid-15th century, culminating in the Battle of Castillon in 1453, where French artillery played a decisive role. The fall of Bordeaux that same year effectively ended English hopes of retaining large continental possessions, closing the book on more than a century of intermittent war. If you trace the war's arc from beginning to end, one of the most striking changes is the transformation of warfare itself. The longbow, so often invoked as the weapon that toppled the mounted knight, indeed played a crucial part in several key victories, but it was only one element among many. The increasing use of pikes, the rise of disciplined infantry, and the gradual introduction of gunpowder and artillery reformulated siegecraft and field engagements. By the war's end, cannon had begun to puncture castle walls with a regularity that altered the calculus of fortification and conquest. These military changes were mirrored by fiscal and administrative shifts in governance. War required money, and the English crown, like the French, developed new mechanisms to raise funds, larger parliaments, more systematic taxes, loans from merchants and financiers, and the mobilization of resources at scale. The cost of ransoms, mercenary pay, and prolonged sieges put pressure on medieval economies, prompting innovation but also resentment among subjects who faced heavier burdens. The war became as much a fiscal struggle as a military one, and the ability to sustain campaigns often hinged on fiscal agility as much as on field command. Social consequences threaded through the conflict in ways that altered everyday life. The Black Death had already shifted labor relations, giving peasants leverage and triggering aristocratic attempts at enforcing old obligations. The war intensified these pressures. Armies raised across regions took men from fields, devastated harvests, and stretched local economies thin. Peasant uprisings flared up, most notably in France with the Jacquerie in 1358, and in England later with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, both symptoms of societies under disproportionate strain. Culture and memory absorbed the war's imprint as well. Chroniclers and poets recorded deeds and losses, shaping how later generations would remember the conflict. Jean Froissart, the Flemish chronicler, wrote voluminously about chivalric contests and noble valor, and his accounts helped secure the Black Prince's legendary status. Yet Froissart's pages also mask harsher truths. Behind the tales of tournaments and courtly romance were sieges, massacres, and the everyday suffering of civilians caught between armies. The role of ransom and captivity in the war is worth lingering on because it reveals medieval attitudes toward honor, economics, and human life. Captured nobles were often treated as lucrative assets. Their ransom could reshape a kingdom's treasury and a family's fortunes. The capture of John II at Poitiers and the massive ransom terms attached show how personal fate and national finance were entangled. At the same time, the system of ransom fostered a cruel calculus. The worth of individuals was assigned in coin and negotiation, a commerce of survival that coexisted with chivalric ideals and religious injunctions. The 100 Years' War also helped catalyze the decline of the old feudal levy in favor of paid armies and contractual service. Lords increasingly hired mercenaries, and kings learned to rely on commissions, retinues, and contracts rather than purely on the obligations of vassalage. This professionalization had a double edge. It made military forces more effective in some ways, but also bred a class of free companies, well-armed bands of soldiers who, when unpaid, turned to banditry and made the countryside unsafe between campaigns. The resulting anarchy made the job of governance even harder. When we look at the Black Prince's tactical mind, we see someone attuned to the new realities of war. He used mobility, intelligence, and the calculated application of terror to achieve objectives without always needing a pitched battle. His chevauchés devastated regions and forced opponents to respond to his rhythm, and his patience and restraint in choosing battle sites paid off at Poitiers. Yet these same methods exacted a brutal toll on civilians and eroded goodwill in regions the English were supposed to hold, laying the groundwork for later losses. The prince's reputation as a paragon of knighthood is complicated by episodes of cruelty and excess. The sack of Limoges in 1370 stands out. Ordered by the prince after a rebellion, it led to a massacre that Froissart and others recorded with horror. For some historians, that act reveals the darker side of medieval warfare, where reprisal and deterrence were used as blunt instruments of policy. For contemporaries, it was a reminder that chivalry often coexisted uneasily with the harsh calculations of occupation and control. Personal honor and the language of chivalry mattered deeply to medieval rulers and commanders, and they mattered to the Black Prince as well. He struck a public persona of piety, valor, and courtly grace, but private correspondence and administrative records hint at the strain behind those performances. He carried the weight of expectation from his father, from his peers, and from the culture that lionized martial prowess. Yet he also carried the weight of governance in a hostile land, a weight that would speed his decline. Even as heroes rose and fell, the war forged institutions that endured. Centralized royal administrations improved tax collection and law enforcement, and the need for sustained military logistics accelerated bureaucratic development. Parliaments learned to assert control over grants of taxes and to demand accountability, while royal councils became more professional in their advice and record-keeping. The war, in other words, was not merely a series of battles, it was a pressure that hardened medieval polities into more modern political forms. The war's end in 1453 did not come with a ceremonious treaty that neatly closed chapters. Instead, it tapered off as English efforts collapsed and French consolidation advanced. Gascony fell to the French. The strategic port of Calais remained briefly in English hands but increasingly isolated, and the dream of an Anglo-French composite monarchy evaporated. By the middle of the 15th century, England's energies turned inward to dynastic struggle, and France, painfully scarred, began the slow process of rebuilding a centralized state. The Black Prince's legacy, like the war itself, is ambivalent. He is celebrated in English memory as a paragon, the ideal of knightly virtue who struck fear into his enemies and inspired loyalty in his men. At the same time, his harsh administration, heavy taxation, and episodes like Limoges complicate that praise. His life traces the arc of medieval knighthood's twilight, brilliant in combat, costly in governance, and ultimately insufficient to secure a permanent union of crowns. Across the battlefields and courts of the 100 Years' War, The human dimension is always present, the soldiers marching through mud, the townspeople barricading themselves in, the wives and mothers left to fend for households, and the children who watched banners go off to war. These everyday scenes stitch together to form a tapestry that is neither wholly glorious nor wholly tragic but deeply human. The war shaped identities, altered demographics, and shifted the expectations of kingship for centuries to come. Memory and myth have their own careers after war's end. Chronicles became foundational texts for later generations constructing national stories. English writers emphasized victories and heroic figures like the Black Prince and Henry V. French narratives, especially after Joan of Arc's rehabilitation, focused on the resilience of the monarchy and the sanctity of kingship personified by Charles VII. These stories mattered deeply, for they helped forge the sense of nationhood that would carry Europe into the early modern period. To follow the 100 Years' War in detail is to watch continuity and change in tension. Feudal ties that once seemed immutable frayed under the strain of extended conflict, while state apparatuses hardened and bureaucracies took shape. Military technology and tactics evolved, from longbow to cannon, from knightly charge to disciplined infantry lines. Economies adapted, sometimes flourishing in wartime industries and sometimes collapsing under requisitions and looting. The war thus stands as a pivot between two medieval worlds, one of aristocratic honors and another edging toward modernity. The story also reveals the limits of personality in history. The Black Prince's charisma and tactical brilliance did much to win victories, yet even he could not secure an English hegemony across France. Structural realities, population fluctuations from the plague, the difficulty of sustaining long-term occupation, the complexities of ruling diverse territories often trumped personal valor. History, in this sense, is a conversation between individual agency and impersonal forces, and the 100 Years' War is a long record of that give and take. Finance is a theme that deserves emphasis because wars are fought with money as much as with steel. The costs of outfitting armies, paying cavalry retinues, supporting sieges, and settling mercenary contracts mounted quickly. Rulers borrowed from bankers and merchants, pledged future revenues, and sometimes debased coinage to meet urgent demands. The fiscal pressure pushed states to evolve, better record-keeping, more reliable taxation systems, and an increasingly regular interaction with commercial institutions changed the relationship between crown and subject. The mercenary bands that proliferated between campaigns became a scourge in their own right. When contracts ended or funds ran out, these soldiers often turned to plunder, creating zones of lawlessness that devastated the countryside. French kings fought not only English armies but also these companies, and their suppression required diplomatic cunning and military creativity. The phenomenon underscored a paradox of medieval warfare. Armies raised to protect could easily become a source of insecurity when payments lapsed. Siege warfare, a crucial part of the 100 Years' War, grew more sophisticated over time. Castles were not only military strongholds but symbols of power and control over surrounding territory. Breaking a castle required engineering, patience, and physical labor as much as brute force. The increasing use of gunpowder and cannons in the late stages of the war allowed attackers to reduce fortifications more reliably, rendering some medieval defenses obsolete and forcing a rethink of military architecture. Diplomacy ran in parallel with the sword. Alliances shifted as English and French kings courted Flemish towns, Burgundian dukes, and various Iberian princes. These relationships were transactional and fluid. The Burgundian dukes, At times, the kingmakers of northern France used their leverage skillfully, aligning and realigning based on local advantage rather than abstract loyalty to a medieval good or evil. The Burgundian factor is perhaps one of the most fascinating subplots of the Hundred Years' War. The Dukes of Burgundy built a power base that often matched or even exceeded the French crown's resources, and their rivalry with the Armagnac faction plunged France into internal civil war in the early 15th century. English kings exploited these divisions, making alliances that suited their immediate needs. Yet in the end, the Burgundian defection to French interests in the 1430s and 1440s helped unravel English ambitions and allowed France to consolidate gains. The experiences of townspeople changed substantially because of the war. Urban centers often bore the brunt of sieges, and their economic fortunes could hinge on which side held the countryside. Trade routes shifted, merchants adapted to the dangers of wartime commerce, and guilds sometimes took on quasi-municipal responsibilities for defense and infrastructure. The result was a new civic energy in many towns, which could bargain with rulers for privileges in exchange for fiscal and military support. Religious life was not untouched by the war. Clergy sometimes acted as negotiators, chroniclers, and moral commentators, interpreting events as providential tests or as moral failures. Churches and monasteries suffered as incursions and plunder reached even their sanctuaries, and the loss of learned men, scholars, and scribes, due to plague and war, left intellectual gaps. Yet the Church also provided a framework for diplomacy and reconciliation, with ecclesiastical figures mediating truces and ransoms when secular channels were blocked. The human stories within the 100 Years' War are often the most telling. Letters from soldiers to families, legal documents about land and tax disputes, and chronicles of sieges give texture to a history that could otherwise be reduced to movements of columns and lists of treaties. These documents reveal fear, courage, fatigue, and stubborn endurance. They also show the ways ordinary people navigated extraordinary times, forging small acts of resistance and survival that together shaped wider outcomes. Even the weather and landscape played roles in campaigns. Muddy fields and rising rivers could turn a planned assault into a rout, as at Agincourt, where rain transformed a French cavalry attack into chaos. Forested areas provided cover for guerrilla tactics, plains favored mounted forces, and the seasonal rhythms of harvests constrained when armies could campaign without starving their own logistics. Military leaders learned to read the land with the same care they read intelligence about enemy movements. The end of the 100 Years' War left legacies that reached forward into the Renaissance and beyond. French monarchy emerged more centralized, better at taxation and administration, and increasingly able to underwrite its own military forces. England, though militarily reduced on the continent, channeled its energies into domestic conflicts that would culminate in the Wars of the Roses. Both nations were changed, feudal bonds loosened, bureaucratic states strengthened, and the medieval order gave way to nascent modernity. For the Black Prince specifically, posterity has been long debating whether he was a tragic hero, a brutal governor, or something in between. His tomb and effigy in Canterbury Cathedral cemented his image as an exemplar of knightly virtue, yet local memories in Gascony and parts of France recall the fiscal pressure and harsh reprisals that marked his rule. His illness and early death left a question hanging. Had he lived longer, might the English position in France have stabilized under his leadership, or were the structural obstacles too great for even his talents to overcome? The role of technology in ending the war cannot be overstated. Gunpowder artillery allowed besiegers to batter walls from a distance and shortened sieges that once took months or even years. That technological shift favored centralized states capable of producing and financing expensive ordnance, and it disadvantaged smaller lords who had formerly relied on their castles for safety. The military revolution was gradual but decisive. By the time Castillon fell, a new era of warfare had arrived. Education and literacy also shifted during and after the war. The need for record-keeping in taxation, administration, and military logistics encouraged bureaucratic literacy among lay officials. Clerks and lawyers gained influence, and a professional administrative class began to emerge. This diffusion of literacy had broader cultural ramifications, seeding institutions and practices that would support future governance and economic growth. The psychological impact of a conflict that lasted generations is another thread that runs through the 100 Years' War. Families measured their histories in campaigns and ransoms, and the memory of sieges passed from one generation to the next. The trauma of long war affected attitudes toward authority and obedience. Soldiers returning from campaigns sometimes found their place in society unsettled, and social mobility shifted as younger sons sought fortunes in foreign wars rather than through inherited land. Language and identity shifted gradually as well. In England, the experience of war with France contributed to the decline of French as the language of the court and helped English reassert itself as a language of administration and literature. Similarly, in France, the war reinforced local and regional differences while simultaneously contributing to a stronger sense of common destiny when faced with foreign occupation. Over decades, these linguistic and cultural currents helped shape the emerging idea of the nation. Diplomatic history from the period reads like a play of shifting loyalties and clever bargaining. Treaties were temporary reprieves more than permanent settlements, and kings often used truces to regroup, repair finances, or wait out unfavorable conditions. The art of negotiation became as central as battlefield command, and diplomats learned to play long games that involved marriage alliances, economic concessions, and the manipulation of rival factions. Marriage alliances were a political tool that sometimes shaped the course of events. The marriage of Henry V to Catherine of Valois, for instance, was a linchpin of the Treaty of Troyes. Similarly, dynastic ties were frequently invoked to justify claims and to secure alliances. Yet marriages did not guarantee loyalty. They were instruments in a broader strategy and could be thwarted by politics, mortality, or personal incompatibility. The historiography of the 100 Years' War is itself a long conversation. Early chroniclers emphasized chivalry and noble deeds because that was their frame of reference. Later historians, looking with a modern lens, analyze fiscal structures, logistical innovations, and the social costs of protracted conflict. Each generation of scholarship reinterprets the war in light of new evidence and new questions, and the Black Prince remains a figure through which many of those questions pass. The war's geographic sweep makes it a study in contrasts: Norman plains and Breton coasts, the vineyards of Aquitaine and the rugged interior of central France, the narrow channels of the Low Countries and the wide fields of northern France. Each region presented different tactical opportunities and political complexities. Commanders who understood local conditions, who could use rivers as barriers, towns as supply points, and forests for concealment, often outmaneuvered those who treated the theater as a uniform space. Looking at the material culture of the period, the armor, weapons, and fortifications helps illuminate everyday realities. Plate armor improved over the century, offering better protection to knights but also increasing the cost of participation in war. The longbow, with its relatively low cost and high rate of fire, democratized battlefield effectiveness in unexpected ways. Siege engines and earthworks evolved alongside fortresses that adapted to new threats, producing a visual record of constant innovation. The role of women in the Hundred Years' War is often underplayed but crucial. Noble women managed estates in their husbands' absences, negotiated ransoms, and sometimes even commanded garrisons or negotiated truces. Figures like Joan of Arc altered the course of campaigns, but many other women exerted influence in quieter ways, through diplomacy, finance, and the maintenance of household economies that kept communities functioning. Their resilience was a hidden backbone of societies under stress. Religious orders and monasteries paid a heavy price during the conflict. Monastic lands were plundered, manuscripts lost, and cultural centers damaged. Yet monasteries also served as places of refuge and charity, housing refugees and providing food in times of scarcity. The Church's dual role, both victim and provider, underscored the complexity of institutions woven into medieval life. The anxieties and expectations of the period also found expression in art and symbolism. Tapestries, stained glass, and illuminated manuscripts depicted battles, saints, and noble patrons, often blending propaganda with pious narrative. Patrons commissioned works that commemorated victories or mourned losses, and the visual culture of the time helped shape public memory. These artifacts now serve as windows into contemporary perceptions of heroism and suffering. The Hundred Years' War also reshaped the legal landscape. The need to adjudicate property disputes arising from long absences and the need to formalize agreements about ransoms and ransom trusts led to more robust legal procedures. Courts developed expertise in dealing with unusual wartime cases, and legal professionals became important intermediaries in the negotiation of obligations and rights. The endgame of the war illustrates how attrition, diplomacy, and technology converged. The French crown's patient reconquest, its ability to field better financed and better supplied forces, and the growing effectiveness of artillery combined to roll back English gains. Battles like Castillon, which hinged on firepower and defensive preparation, showed how the lessons of decades could be applied decisively. England's withdrawal from most continental holdings was not a single cataclysmic defeat but the cumulative result of strategic erosion over decades. Yet even after 1453, the war's consequences reverberated. The loss of continental territories altered English foreign policy and contributed to internal dynastic strife. In France, centralization proceeded, laying foundations for monarchical power that would play out in the early modern period. The memory of the conflict lingered in literature, law, and politics, a long shadow that shaped identities and ambitions for generations. The Black Prince's image in later centuries oscillated between sanctified hero and flawed ruler. Ballads and chronicles celebrated his military genius, while other records and local memories remembered the hardships his campaigns inflicted. The multiplicity of perspectives around his figure reveals a broader truth about the Hundred Years' War. It cannot be told from one vantage point alone. The experience of war depended on whether you were commander or peasant, townsman or merchant, bishop or soldier. Language, law, society, and technology all moved through the grinder of this prolonged conflict and came out altered. The war pushed medieval polities to adapt, to find new revenue streams, and to develop administrative capacities that would have lasting consequences. The long arc from feudal fragmentation to nascent centralized states runs clearly through the Hundred Years' War, and the Black Prince occupies a central place along that arc as both exemplar and cautionary tale. The extensive use of mercenary forces also led to the proliferation of military entrepreneurship. Captains who once served the lord's immediate interests began to see profit in hiring themselves out, sometimes turning into quasi-feudal lords with private power bases. This phenomenon created both flexibility for kings and unpredictability for communities, as loyalties shifted according to pay and plunder rather than hereditary duty. In the cultural afterlife of the war, literature and drama picked up its themes and characters. English dramatists and poets found in Henry V and the exploits of Edward III and the Black Prince material for national myth-making. French writers returned repeatedly to the figure of Joan of Arc, whose trial and rehabilitation became emblematic of the nation's spiritual and political rebirth. These cultural retellings helped shape national narratives in ways formal treaties never could. When historians piece together the 100 Years' War from fragments, they rely on chronicles, fiscal records, court rolls, and archaeological evidence to reconstruct movements and motives. Each source has its biases. Chroniclers favored noble deeds, fiscal records reduce humans to sums, and archaeology catches what texts omit. A full picture therefore requires reading across disciplines and acknowledging that certainty is often more elusive than narrative demands. One cannot ignore the roles of smaller theaters in the broader conflict. Brittany, Burgundy, and the Low Countries were not mere backdrops, they were active arenas where rivalries were played out. Control of ports and access to trade routes mattered deeply, and regional politics often determined the success of larger strategic plans. These peripheral conflicts fed into the central struggle between English and French kings in ways that made the war diffuse and enduring. Cultural exchange occurred despite, or because of, the conflict. Merchants traveling to port cities, ambassadors moving between courts, and soldiers billeted in towns carried ideas, goods, and languages with them. The circulation of coins, fabrics, and manuscript traditions across contested borders created a cross-pollination that influenced taste, technology, and knowledge. War, paradoxically, did not isolate but connected regions through commerce and contact. The role of the papacy and international Christendom in mediating claims was important but limited. Popes sometimes attempted to intervene, issuing calls for peace or crusading rhetoric that framed conflicts in spiritual terms. Yet by and large, the papacy could not impose lasting solutions, and religious rhetoric often served as one of many instruments rulers deployed to legitimize action rather than as an independent force capable of ending the fighting. In tactical terms, leaders learned the value of combined arms, coordinating infantry, archers, cavalry, and artillery in ways that neutralized the strengths of any single arm. The English longbowmen were devastating when protected by stakes or earthworks and supported by dismounted men-at-arms. The French adapted to these lessons, deploying better prepared formations and later integrating artillery in ways that shifted the balance on key battlefields. The psychological warfare of the period also mattered. Chevauchés devastated morale and made populations question their rulers' ability to protect them, while ceremonial displays of generosity or cruelty sent messages across borders. The spectacle of a captured king paraded in an enemy camp, or the lavishness of a battlefield camp, conveyed political messages that reverberated through courts and markets. Perception often mattered as much as reality. A reputation for invincibility could deter enemies just as effectively as a field army could defeat them. The network of castles and fortifications across France and England served as both strategic anchors and symbols of control. Holding a castle meant more than controlling a hill. It was a means of administering surrounding lands, collecting rents, and exerting legal power. The systematic reduction of castles by gunpowder and the adaptation of fortification design in response to artillery represent a pragmatic dialogue between offense and defense that defined late medieval military architecture. The use of intelligence and espionage developed in subtle but consequential ways. Scouts, local informants, and intercepted correspondence provided commanders with the information they needed to maneuver effectively. The ability to read intention, to anticipate reinforcements, and to act on incomplete information separated successful campaigns from disastrous ones. In a world without rapid communication, good intelligence was gold. The transition of knighthood from feudal obligation to professional role had social consequences. Younger sons who could not inherit land sought careers as retainers, mercenaries, or administrators. This mobility altered family strategies and reshaped the composition of military leadership. Knighthood's prestige remained, but its economic and social foundations were changing. The end of English continental ambition led to a pivot in English foreign policy, with greater focus on maritime concerns and relations with the Low Countries. The loss of territories forced reevaluation of strategic priorities and encouraged investment in naval power and trade networks. This maritime reorientation would have long-term consequences for English expansion and the later rise of overseas empire. The war's long shadow extended into law and custom as well. Laws concerning ransom, the treatment of prisoners, and the rights of citizens in occupied territories evolved through practice and treaty. Legal norms that had once seemed local became standardized as rulers sought consistent rules to manage wartime economies and diplomacy. This slow legal homogenization facilitated longer-term governance across formerly decentralized polities. The 100 Years' War illustrates how conflict can accelerate both decay and innovation. It destroyed amounts of wealth, decimated populations in specific regions, and caused social trauma. At the same time, it spurred changes in technology, statecraft, and economic practice that prepared Europe for a new era. The sharp edge of destruction paradoxically cut away some medieval structures and allowed new institutions to take shape. Remembering the Black Prince gives us a case study in how personal valor can be historicized and mythologized. Contemporary accounts praised him for courage and generosity, while later historians have evaluated his administrative decisions and the long-term consequences of his campaigns. His life remains a prism through which we can see the complexity of leadership in a time when the demands of war and governance were often at cross purposes. The narrative of the war is also a narrative of human endurance. Communities rebuilt after sieges, cities adapted to new trade patterns, and families reconstituted lives after loss. The slow, stubborn work of reconstruction, repairing walls, restoring fields, and re-establishing markets, was as important to the end result as any battle. War's conclusion was as much about reconstruction as about victory or defeat. The 100 Years' War offers lessons about the costs of prolonged conflict and the importance of political will and fiscal sustainability. Rulers who could not maintain popular consent for taxation or who misjudged the limits of local loyalties found their ambitions frustrated. Political legitimacy, administrative competence, and pragmatic diplomacy often mattered as much as martial prowess in determining long-term outcomes. Exploring the war's local cases, individual sieges, specific town resistances, and particular treaties reveals a mosaic of human choices. Each engagement contained microhistories of courage, error, betrayal, and negotiation. These smaller stories, stitched together, make the larger narrative comprehensible not as a single thread but as a woven cloth of innumerable human acts. The Black Prince's influence on military practice and noble culture continued beyond his death through his son, Richard II, and the later generations who studied his campaigns as exemplars. His image in tournaments and heraldry persisted, and his tactical choices informed future leaders who wrestled with similar dilemmas of occupation and supply. Yet the limits of his achievements remind us that even the finest commanders must contend with resources, public opinion, and the inertia of institutional structures. The 100 Years' War raises questions that historians still debate, whether it was a proto-national conflict driven by emerging national identity or a series of dynastic disputes shaped by feudal structures. The answer, as often, is complex. Elements of both are present. The war fostered nascent national sentiments, yet it was also embedded in a feudal world of personal loyalties and dynastic claims, a hybrid that evolved through the conflict's long course. As the centuries passed, the memory of the war continued to be invoked by monarchs and statesmen seeking precedent or legitimacy. The heroic narratives of Agincourt and Poitiers were marshaled to inspire troops and bind people together. At the same time, the cautionary examples of overreach and economic exhaustion were repeated as warnings. The story of the 100 Years' War, its glories and its tragedies, remained a resource for political imagination. In the final accounting, the 100 Years' War was a long, expensive, often brutal process of state formation. It pushed kings to innovate, forced societies to adapt, and rewired military practice in ways that carried into the early modern era. The Black Prince's life, brilliant and troubled, encapsulates the tension between medieval chivalry and the structural demands of prolonged conflict. If we listen closely to the echoes of that period, we hear not only the clash of arms but the slow grind of administrative reform, the sob of grief in towns after sieges, the creak of ship timbers in channel storms, and the whisper of treaties inked by exhausted negotiators. All these sounds compose the long score of a war that changed Europe. To follow them is to understand how the past reshapes the present and how individuals like the Black Prince, brilliant and mortal, become landmarks in the vast landscape of history. The 100 Years' War stretches across a landscape of shifting loyalties, dynastic claims, and long winters of waiting, but when you chart its course you can see a century shaped by fits and starts, victory and ruin, sieges and truces, until the line of fate skewed and the French revival began to breathe alive. For a long time England seemed to have the upper hand, its armies moving like tides across the Channel, winning field battles and seizing great cities. Yet wars change not only on the outcomes of engagements but on the morale of nations, the fortunes of ruling houses, the resilience of townsfolk, and sometimes on the voice of a single person who galvanizes others. That voice would appear in an unlikely place and usher in the turn of the tide, pulling a beleaguered kingdom from brink to resurgence. To understand why Joan of Arc's arrival mattered so much, you need to feel the exhaustion and fragmentation that came before her. The conflict began in the mid-14th century over claims to the French throne, and it was a long, grinding contest between English kings with naval strength and French nobles whose loyalty was often local rather than national. Over decades, the war carved deep channels of ruin through the countryside, castles sieged, harvests burned, law and order strained by mercenary bands. By the early 15th century, after a series of devastating defeats and the politically explosive Treaty of Troyes, the French monarchy lay undermined and the Dauphin, Charles, was reduced to a shadowed figure with contested legitimacy. The Treaty of Troyes was a legal and symbolic earthquake that declared Henry V of England the heir to the French crown after Charles VI, leaving the Dauphin disinherited and his supporters scattered. Henry's victories, culminating in Agincourt and a string of successes in Normandy and northern France, placed English power at the heart of the kingdom. Yet treaties and victories on paper cannot eradicate the deeper currents of identity, local law, or the stubborn civic loyalties of towns that had their own stakes in stability. And for all the English gains, France still contained a fractious web of dukedoms and principalities, among which Burgundy stood as an especially decisive player. Burgundy's alliance with England cut both ways. Suddenly the conflict was not only Anglo-French but a complex collision of regional ambitions. The Duke of Burgundy, at times an ally of England and at other moments a bargaining partner with the French crown, could swing the balance with his army and political maneuvering. His assassinated son and the shifting allegiances after 1419 deepened the political chaos. When the Burgundians and English cooperated, Paris could be held and much of northern France could be administered as if it were under English law. Yet in the provinces, resentment accumulated, simmering into an energy that would someday be harnessed. That energy took shape against a backdrop of brutal hardship. The Black Death and the decade-long disruptions of trade and labor had left societies raw and eager for order. Peasants had become more aware of their bargaining power, towns had fortified their rights, and mercenaries began to dominate the post-war landscape, hired soldiers who pledged to the highest bidder and who often pillaged when unpaid. The social fabric of France was frayed, and the central authority needed not only an army but a narrative, a reason for men and women to recommit to a single crown rather than local lords. It required moral and symbolic renewal as much as military competence. Enter Joan of Arc, or rather, let us first meet the woman who would be called Jeanne of Domremy, in a place where the borderlands between Lorraine and Burgundy made identities fluid and loyalties conditional. She was born into a modest peasant family in a village that bore witness to skirmishes and troop movements, the sort of frontier place where the great tides of history alighted on ordinary lives. Her early life was marked by simple work and piety, and according to contemporary accounts she was reserved and devout, attending Mass and listening for God's voice in a world that had grown noisy with war. Those voices, she later said, called to her in childhood, urging her toward a destiny that would seem impossible to those around her. Stories of those voices began to spread first through local gossip and then through the more formal channels of church and crown when Joan insisted on more than hearsay, that she had been chosen to lift France from its humiliation. The claim was astonishing, a young, unlettered peasant girl declaring divine sanction to see the Dauphin crowned and to expel the English. Skeptics abounded, and some who heard her dismissed her as deluded or worse. Yet in communities where hope had been thin as tea, words against the world can catch like flame. Her convictions and her refusal to back down made officials in neighboring towns curious and cautious in equal measure. The path from Domremy to the royal court was not direct, but it was deliberate. Joan sought out the local garrison and the burgesses who could shepherd her toward a meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of Vaucouleurs, a small town with a fortified leadership. Baudricourt did not initially treat her omen as apostolic instruction. He tested her, sent emissaries to verify her background, and even tried to deflect her. But Joan persisted, insisting that God had told her to raise the siege of Orleans and to bring the Dauphin to Reims for coronation. Persistence, in this case, was a form of audacity that mattered more than mere rhetorical flourish. It signaled a kind of inner consistency that made it harder for men of the armor to ignore her. When she reached the court, the scene was awkward and tense. The Dauphin, Charles, had good reasons to be wary of claimants and provocateurs. He had to balance fragile alliances, check suspicious nobles, and stay aware of the English and Burgundian forces pressing in from the north. Joan's arrival put the court in an uncomfortable position. She offered a possible rallying point but also a risk to be managed. The contest of evidence required both clerical examination and political calculation. Theologians and advisors wanted to determine whether Joan was moving by divine guidance or simple manipulation. Their indecision, however, began to turn in Joan's favor, partly because the kingdom had grown hungry for any sign of legitimate turnaround. Charles's inspection of Joan at Chinon was a private moment that has been remade in posterity as dramatic revelation, yet in the room itself necessity and caution intermingled. The Dauphin tested her, sought to verify her prophecies, and yet also recognized the political advantages of a popular figure who claimed divine authority on his behalf. Joan's knowledge of certain intimate facts, the manner of her speech, and the clarity of her insistence all contributed to a decision that was both symbolic and strategic. To accept her was not merely to gratify faith, it was, in the long view, to claim an instrument of public legitimacy that might help rally fractured nobility and embattled towns. Once she had an escort and a small retinue, Joan's public ascent quickened. She did not appear in the trappings of courtly nobility but in simple armor cut to her size, a pragmatic outfit that mixed piety and soldiering. Her banners bore an image of Christ and the fleur-de-lis, a pairing of the sacred and the royal that resonated with long-standing French symbolism. As she approached Orleans, she brought not a full army but an infusion of purpose. Her mere presence stiffened the sinews of defenders and unsettled siege works worn thin by protracted operations. Soldiers who had been fighting out of duty found in her something like certainty, an idea that they were fighting for a rightful king and that their actions knitted into a larger moral narrative. The siege of Orleans had been the most crucial choke point in French resistance, a city that, if fallen, would have allowed English forces to march unobstructed into the Loire Valley. For months the English and their Burgundian allies had tightened their stranglehold. Joan arrived with relief and a plan that was as much psychological as tactical. She urged sallies, organized assaults on key fortifications known as the Bastilles, and insisted that the defenders fight with zeal. Her involvement invigorated the defenders and demoralized the besiegers. Contemporaries recorded that the English commanders, accustomed to the methodical engineering of sieges, were unnerved by a sudden surge of audacity and popular fervor. Within days the siege unraveled as the English withdrew, and Orleans became a turning point in the collective imagination of the French resistance. Lifting the siege was a concrete moment of reversal, but what it did to momentum mattered even more. Corps of men who had been battered and tattered found renewed confidence. Places that had known siege for months began to reopen markets and churches, and French nobles who had been cautious by the Dauphin's side now tasted the possibility of revival. News of the victory rippled southward and westward, encouraging towns to resist English garrisons and prompting wavering lords to reconsider their loyalties. The sensation was contagious. Victory breeds legitimacy as surely as legitimacy breeds followers, and the Dauphin, moving toward Reims, now had both a sainted narrative and a practical route for his coronation. The march toward Reims shows how symbolism and logistics entwined. Reims carried deep meaning because it was the traditional coronation site of French kings, where an unbroken chain of anointings lent sacral depth to royal succession. To crown Charles at Reims was therefore to rewrite the Treaty of Troyes in symbolic terms, placing France's sacred stamp on his rightful rule. But Reims was not merely ceremonial. To reach it required securing supply lines, opening sieges, and ensuring that the path was not vulnerable to English or Burgundian interception. Military and spiritual aims drew closer as Joan's presence helped consolidate forces and buoy the populaces lining their way to the cathedral. The coronation itself lasted beyond ceremony. It was an act of state-making that reconfigured royal authority in public. Crowning Charles VII was not an instantaneous fix. He still faced internal rivals and foreign armies, but it allowed the monarchy to stand in its own right, assert the legitimacy of its claims, and reframe the war as a campaign to restore rightful order rather than as a series of opportunistic skirmishes. The moment allowed administrative reforms to be pursued more energetically, as men who had been on the fence now found reason to support the Crown's institutions. In the months that followed, the monarchy began measures to raise more effective troops, to reform finances, and to work toward the long-term project of consolidating royal power. Joan's influence was not confined to the battlefield. Her presence shaped diplomatic exchanges, her victories altered bargaining positions, and her image animated sermons and public rituals. She intimidated some nobles and emboldened others. Her aura pressured local councils into resisting English-imposed authority. Soldiers and townsfolk began to talk in terms of a single nation, a nascent sentiment that would not yet match modern nationalism but which moved beyond mere loyalty to a local lord. These linguistic and psychological shifts reshaped the war's terrain as much as any trebuchet or pike. Yet Joan was not a solo engine. The revival required organizational shifts in how the French prosecuted war. Military reforms included better use of artillery, more centralized pay systems for troops, and the recruitment of permanent forces rather than purely feudal levies. Artillery, in particular, began to change the face of sieges. Heavier guns could batter walls that had once defied assault, and the growing expertise in casting and deploying cannons gave defenders and attackers new options. The Crown's increased ability to tax and to requisition resources played a role in this modernization, aligning military needs with administrative change. These reforms gradually created an army less dependent on the peculiarly medieval bonds of vassalage and more on sustained institutional backing. As the military balance shifted, the English cause began to fray from within. The long logistical chains that sustained English garrisons across the Channel creaked under the strain of persistent French countermeasures and the realities of controlling a hostile, often unreconciled populace. English kings complained about the costs, suffered from internal political disputes at home, and saw their continental strategy undermined by rising French competence. The Burgundian alliance, which had propped up English gains, began to fracture as dukes recalculated their interests against the rising tide of French royal power and local fatigue with perpetual war. Political shifts on both sides slowly, inexorably, loosened English hold on French soil. But historical tides are uneven. Joan's campaign did not produce immediate, unbroken conquest. Instead, it catalyzed a long series of sieges, skirmishes, negotiations, and setbacks. Her career, in military terms, was compressed into a few dramatic months of operational brilliance, after which she was captured and her fate turned into a bitter legal theater. That she was taken by Burgundian forces at Compiègne underscores the risks inherent in frontline leadership and the instability of alliances. Her capture did not end the revival she had begun, yet it opened the door to one of the most controversial episodes of the entire conflict, her trial and execution. The trial at Rouen was a grotesque inversion of the triumphant narrative she had embodied. It mixed ecclesiastical process with political motive and used legal mechanisms in the service of conquest. English authorities and certain French collaborators sought to frame her as a heretic and a witch, charges that carried the potential to strip her of moral authority and to delegitimize the movement she had inspired. The proceedings were marked by irregularities, the judges were often biased, the legal backing questionable, and the pressures to obtain a guilty verdict immense. In that courtroom, the tools of medieval jurisprudence were deployed with political precision, aiming to extinguish not only her life but the symbolic power she wielded over French morale. Joan's execution by burning in 1431 was intended to be a public spectacle that would demoralize the French cause and silence a voice that had proved inconvenient to those who sought to win by law as well as by the sword. Yet human events can rebound, and the intended effect backfired in some respects. Martyrdom can transform a leader's death into a new source of legitimacy, and her fiery end galvanized further loyalty among those who had accepted her mission. Within years, ecclesiastical and secular actors began re-examining the trial, and the seeds of rehabilitation were sown as the political winds continued to shift away from the English and their allies. The posthumous rehabilitation trial, decades later, retraced the legal and moral steps of the condemnation and declared Joan innocent of the crimes for which she had been executed. That verdict did more than restore a name. It re-legitimized the narrative that had supported the restored monarchy and helped to purge the stain of heresy that had been used to justify the English position. The rehabilitation is itself a political act, reflective of the changing circumstances in which the English grip on France had weakened and the French monarchy sought to rewrite the story of the previous decades. To reassess a condemned woman as a saint and a national hero is to rewrite both memory and identity. In the long arc of the war, Joan's role was catalytic rather than solitary. Her victories and martyrdom energized processes already underway: reform of royal finances, consolidation of central authority, and the professionalization of armies. These processes unfolded over decades and required far-sighted administrative measures such as the establishment of reliable treasuries, the consolidation of royal courts, and the extension of royal justice into the provinces. The Crown's ability to fund troops and to control taxation was as important as battlefield heroics, for wars are ultimately costly endeavors that require systems to sustain them. Joan supplied inspiration and timing, the monarchy supplied the mechanics. By the middle of the 15th century, the strategic picture had changed dramatically from the bleak map of 30 years before. French forces, better led and better supplied, gradually regained territory across the Loire and in Normandy, using artillery to reduce once formidable castles and employing campaigns that combined sieges with careful diplomacy. English holdings shrank as local elites defected or were persuaded by treaties and princes to shift their allegiance. The sea remained a bridge for the English, but without sufficient local bases and with the French crown's increasing capacity to contest coastal positions, the land was slowly reclaimed. The war concluded only after repeated attrition and strategic unraveling of the English continental position. The end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453 did not dissolve every political dispute, nor did it instantly create a unified modern state, but it did usher France toward the centralized monarchy that would dominate European politics in subsequent centuries. The process of reconstruction and consolidation required reintegration of territories, reconciliation with regional powers, and the re-establishment of royal law across the realm. The monarchy increasingly projected itself into the daily lives of subjects through taxation, legal standardization, and the careful building of administrative institutions. Joan's part in that story was both hammer and mirror. She hammered the nation into motion and reflected back to the people the idea of a France in which the throne had sacred and popular sanction. The cultural and symbolic aftermath of Joan's life rippled through European art, literature, and memory. Poets and chroniclers recast her as a valiant figure, Painters and playwrights would later transform her into a spectral symbol of nationhood. Even within the church, her later canonization affirmed the ways sanctity and politics frequently intersected in the formation of collective identity. Her iconography, sword raised, banner unfurled, hair cropped in practical defiance of feminine convention, remains a potent image of defiance against occupying powers and of a people's yearning for restoration. Over centuries, each political movement would reinterpret her image, sometimes elevating it to national myth-making, sometimes to religious devotion. Historical memory is never neutral. During the Revolution and subsequent eras, Joan's figure was invoked by groups as disparate as conservative monarchists and Republican patriots, each reading their needs into her story. She could be a saintly daughter of the church for clerical parties or a proto-national heroine for secular nationalists. That malleability is itself revealing. Certain figures become symbols because they can bear a range of meanings, offering coalitions a shared locus of feeling even when their programs diverge. Joan's capacity to be claimed by multiple, even opposing, political streams testifies to the depth of her symbolic resonance. Modern historians have continued to debate the details of Joan's life, her visions, her military command, the nature of her piety, and her legal trial. Yet these debates rest on a basic truth that remains visible: her presence accelerated tendencies already present in the French polity. She did not conjure a state from nothing, but she supplied a catalytic episode that allowed long-brewing processes to surge forward. Her life teaches us something about the intersection of providence and politics, the potency of charismatic leadership, and the ways symbolic acts can alter practical realities. She occupies a special place in the history of warfare, where psychology and morale can be as decisive as engineering and supply chains. To discuss Joan is also to describe the lived realities of soldiers and civilians in late medieval France, the bite of cold mornings in damp encampments, the creak of leather harness as armor shifted, the smell of gunpowder that began to appear with the new artillery, and the nervous tension in towns watching armed columns pass their gates. War reshaped landscapes as much as it reshaped politics. Roads were widened for supply trains, castles were refortified or dismantled, and commerce adapted to the realities of shifting borders. The social consequences were profound. Populations displaced by conflict created refugee flows, mercenary bands ravaged unprotected villages, and economies rerouted resources to fit military exigencies. In the midst of all this, the presence of a figure like Joan offered a rare and potent emotional countercurrent. The tactics of the era were themselves in transition. Medieval battlefields still featured armored knights and cavalry charges, but infantry formations, pike units, and archers redefined outcomes. English longbowmen had played a decisive role in earlier victories, their rapid-fire volleys and disciplined ranks breaking the impact of superior cavalry. Later, the increasing role of gunpowder weaponry made serfdom-based armies less dominant and highlighted the need for technical skills and logistical organization. Commanders had to adapt to a changing toolkit, and those who did so successfully could control sieges and field engagements more reliably. Economics underpinned military capacity in ways that contemporaries sometimes overlooked. A noble's ability to field a retinue depended on his estate's yields and on the cash to pay mercenaries. Towns that prospered through trade could furnish levies or loan funds to the crown, while regions devastated by war could not. Monarchs who learned to tax more consistently and to administer finances effectively held a decisive advantage because they could sustain campaigns longer than fractured feudal coalitions. This reality, more than romantic valor, defined the extended capacity to wage war and to reclaim territory for central authority. Diplomacy and marriage alliances remained central to the fabric of this era. Royal unions could shift allegiance patterns and open alliances that altered the strategic map. The interplay between kinship and politics was vivid in a Europe where dynastic claims crossed borders and where personal ties often had the force of treaties. Yet diplomatic skill was not always sufficient to overcome military ground realities, and the better diplomats were those who could pair negotiation with credible force. In the case of the Hundred Years' War, diplomatic breakthroughs often reflected battlefield realities rather than overturned them entirely. Religion provided both motivation and framework for action. Catholicism formed the moral language of kings and commons alike, and ecclesiastical endorsement conferred a kind of sanctified legitimacy on rule. Bishops and clerics were often involved in mediation and in adjudicating claims, and the church's stamp could sway public opinion. Joan's own religious claims thus operated within an intelligible framework. If a peasant girl asserted a divine commission, the language of faith made that claim intelligible and potent. That potency could be harnessed politically and, as her trial shows, could be turned into an instrument of delegitimization by political opponents. The role of localities, cities, towns, and provinces was crucial. While kings aspired to centralization, much of medieval life remained locally organized and administered. City councils fortified their rights, guilds protected trade privileges, and urban militias could influence military operations by holding strategic points. The crown's relationship with towns grew in complexity as it alternately relied upon them for taxes and manpower and squabbled over jurisdiction. The resurgence that followed Joan's victories depended on winning the confidence of these local actors and on integrating their capacities into a wider royal strategy. The shifting morale of the people played a psychological role difficult to quantify but essential to the course of events. A string of defeats can erode the will to resist. A decisive victory can refertilize courage. This was no abstract phenomenon but a lived reality in inns, markets, and parishes, where rumors spread fast and hope proved contagious. Joan's presence functioned as a fulcrum for hope. People who had been leaning toward accommodation found it easier to resist, and those who had been neutral often took sides. The war thus became a struggle not merely of territory but of hearts and imaginations. Memory and memorialization continued their long work after arms fell silent. Chronicles written in the decades after the war constructed narratives that elevated victors and explained defeats, often favoring the author's patrons. The process of memorializing events allowed future rulers to claim continuity and righteousness. Statues, stained glass, and songs kept alive the memory of sieges and coronations, and they turned major events into cautionary tales or heroic exemplars depending on perspective. Joan's own memorials multiplied, some focused on her sanctity, some on her tactical brilliance, and others on her role as a national emblem. Across Europe, the implications of the Hundred Years' War were felt in military innovation and political centralization. Monarchs in other realms gleaned lessons about the need for professional armies and better bureaucracies to sustain long conflicts. The idea that a kingdom required the means to extract resources and to administer justice broadly took root in royal strategies. These lessons would shape the transition from medieval polities to early modern states, as rulers increasingly claimed the monopoly on legitimate violence and cultivated administrative tools to exercise it. The English, meanwhile, endured a long, slow decline in continental holdings, their political energies turning homewards as resources were taxed and nobles grew restive. The costs of maintaining overseas possessions and the difficulty of winning a reconciled peace led to a strategic retrenchment. England's internal politics, already volatile, grew more fractious, contributing to conflicts such as the Wars of the Roses later in the century. This inward turn altered English identity over time, consolidating maritime and insular tendencies at the expense of continental ambitions. Joan's eventual canonization centuries later crystallized a complex interaction between religion, nationalism, and historical memory. The Church's formal recognition in the 20th century did not simply sanctify a medieval peasant, it confirmed the ongoing cultural power she wielded. Her sainthood reframed her as a symbol of spiritual courage and moral clarity, and it allowed religious communities to claim her story alongside secular nationalists. The layered meanings accorded to her life underscore how historical figures can become congregations of competing meanings over time. Artistic renderings of Joan and the war recast scenes into visual and literary forms that anchored them in popular imagination. From medieval tapestries to modern cinema, artists have used her story to probe themes of faith, gender, and nationhood. Each representation reveals as much about the era of its creation as it does about the past it seeks to depict. In music, painting, and drama, Joan's figure took on dramatic contours that made her accessible to audiences far removed from the mud and din of 15th-century battlefields. Education and historiography have refined our understanding of the 100 Years' War and Joan's role within it, moving away from simple heroic or villainous portraits toward more complex readings. Scholars analyze primary sources, interrogate biases in chronicles, and reconstruct social and economic contexts to better understand decisions made on the ground. Modern approaches also pay attention to the roles of women, peasants, and lesser-known actors whose lives were transformed by the conflict. These nuanced examinations deepen our appreciation of how the war reshaped lives at every social level. Joan's gender was an element of both scandal and power. In a society where commanding troops was perceived as a male prerogative, her leadership challenged social conventions and provoked intense curiosity and debate. Some admired her for transcending gender expectations in service to the crown, others attacked her precisely because she defied norms. Her choice of armor and cropped hair were practical but also symbolic acts that inverted ordinary expectations, and they contributed to the aura that surrounded her. Those inversions made her a more potent figure precisely because she embodied disruption. The diplomatic diplomacy around her capture and execution shows how hard politics can be disguised in the language of law. The English and their collaborators framed the legal questions in ways that suited their ends, and ecclesiastical sanction lent a patina of legitimacy to what had strategic origins. The law could be wielded as a weapon to strip an opponent of moral authority, and that is exactly how Joan's trial functioned. The legal theater was therefore not a standalone morality play but rather an instrument of statecraft deployed to consolidate conquest. Longer-term institutional changes in France followed from the process of revival. The monarchy increased its oversight over taxation and legal structures, and royal officials grew in number and importance. These institutions functioned to insulate the crown from the vicissitudes of noble will and to provide more predictable mechanisms for mobilizing resources. They did not create a modern administrative state overnight, but they set the foundations for later centralization and for the machinery that would sustain France as a powerful European actor. Reading the 100 Years' War through the prism of Joan's presence reveals how charismatic leadership can redirect historical trajectories without being the only factor in success. War is complex, and Joan's unique role was to focus, to embody, and to catalyze forces that might otherwise have dissipated. Her life underscores both the contingency of history, the strange accidents and personal choices that alter courses, and the structures that make outcomes plausible, such as finance, logistics, and institutional reform. Together, these elements produced a revival that converted tactical victories into lasting political change. In the end, Joan of Arc became both a historical actor and a story that successive generations would retell to explain themselves. She remains a powerful reminder that human decisions, acts of faith, and moments of courage can recalibrate long conflicts. The 100 Years' War did not end because one woman lived or died, but because a constellation of changes, military, administrative, diplomatic, and psychological, gradually reorganized power. Joan's arrival accelerated those changes and gave a craving populace a figure toward whom they could project their hopes for restoration and dignity. Those who study the period continue to unearth subtleties, letters, financial records, and municipal registers that illuminate how towns coped with shifting authority, how soldiers were paid, and how families navigated loyalties. Each document refines our sense of the past and adds texture to a story too often reduced to battle names and dates. When you read the ledgers of a provincial town or the orders from a royal treasury, you see the gears that turned the great machine of war and the small human details that made large outcomes possible. Joan's story sits atop those gears as a memorable emblem of the human capacity to reconfigure history. Conflict breeds innovation in unexpected places. The war stimulated advances in engineering, in military logistics, and in administrative bookkeeping that would have wider implications. Castles were reconceived, supply chains developed more robustly, and command structures adapted to longer-term campaigns. These innovations fed into Europe's broader transition from medieval to early modern practices. The processes that allowed France to reclaim its territory also made possible the kinds of centralized governance that would define future centuries. Personal stories from the period remind us that history is made by people who had families, fears, and private joys as well as public duties. Soldiers wrote letters home, merchants kept inventories with a care that revealed anxieties, and women managed estates in the absence of husbands. These small human acts, preserving grain stores, training local militias, bargaining for peace, created the social continuity that allowed political structures to survive and recover. Joan's interventions mattered because they touched these daily realities, offering a reason to persist through privation and fear. As the war wound down, the French monarchy undertook the slow work of reconciliation, rebuilding infrastructure, and re-establishing justice, tasks mundane but essential to secure lasting peace. Roads were repaired, courts reopened, and administrative centers reconstituted. Monarchical power was reasserted not solely by proclamation but by presence. Sheriffs and royal officers took up posts, towns resumed regular markets, and the tax collectors returned with less resistance. The revival that Joan helped begin was thus as much about governance as it was about martial prowess. In many ways, Joan's legacy is a testament to the power of symbol to reorganize reality. Symbols don't win battles on their own, but they can bind people into collective action, justify extraordinary measures, and sustain morale through bleak stretches. Her banner, her armor, and the story of God's voice gave a fragmented people a shared story to rally around, and that story helped bridge the gap between local interests and the claim of a single crown. Symbol and structure together created conditions under which France could recover and transform. The last stage of the 100 Years' War unfolded like a long, drawn-out falling away of English power from the continent, a steady erosion that combined military setbacks, political mistakes, and a rising French dynamism that would not be denied. When we speak of the collapse of English power at the end of this conflict, we are not describing a single cataclysmic moment but a series of intertwined collapses in authority, finance, morale, and legitimacy. Each of these threads tightened and frayed the English hold on French soil until the familiar banners that had flown in Normandy and Aquitaine were either surrendered, purchased away, or simply no longer defended. The story of this decline is also the story of how a nation remade itself in the aftermath, and how ideas about kingship, nation, and warfare were forever changed by the experience. The scene at the war's end must be framed against the bright, early successes of Henry V and the humiliating Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which seemed at the time to hand the French crown to an English dynasty. Henry's victories at Agincourt and his skillful diplomacy convinced many contemporaries that England might supplant the Valois line and rule France as a unified realm. Yet victory on the battlefield had been costly, and the political landscape remained fractious, with Burgundians and Armagnacs divided and local loyalties shifting like sand beneath the army's feet. The death of Henry V in 1422 and the accession of an infant king, Henry VI, transformed potential dominance into a generational management problem that England was not equipped to solve. With an absent king and an overstretched treasury, the English position in France weakened as governance faltered. The regents governing in Henry VI's name in England could not sustain the level of investment needed to keep garrisons supplied, nor could they handle the delicate diplomacy required to hold together the patchwork of alliances. Meanwhile, France under Charles VII began to recover from the internal divisions that had made peace elusive for a generation. The emergence of more effective leadership, localized reform, and a revitalized army shifted the balance away from English advantage and toward a reclaimed French sovereignty. At the heart of the war's final chapters stood Joan of Arc, a figure whose dramatic interventions accelerated the French turnaround by crystallizing support for Charles VII and by reinvigorating morale. Joan's presence at the Siege of Orleans in 1429 provided the psychological jolt the French needed. Her improbable success altered minds as decisively as any treaty. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims, accomplished with her help, served a powerful symbolic purpose. It restored the sacred legitimacy of the Valois line in a way that the Treaty of Troyes could never quite extinguish. Even after Joan's capture, trial, and execution in 1431, the momentum she generated continued to influence French operations and bolster public belief in eventual victory. Military transformation accompanied this political shift, so that by the 1440s the French were no longer simply reacting to English moves but were actively retaking territory with method and deliberation. Charles VII and his advisors invested in military reforms that improved the logistics and discipline of French forces, including the establishment of a standing artillery train and better paid and organized infantry. Artillery in particular became a decisive innovation, capable of breaching fortifications that had earlier been safe from sustained attack. Castles that once seemed impregnable were now vulnerable, and the English reliance on fortified towns and garrisons looked less like mastery and more like a defensive scramble. The capture of Normandy was a turning point. After a series of campaigns, driven by French commanders such as the Constable Arthur de Richemont and helped by the grinding attrition of English resources, Normandy fell back into French hands by 1450. The loss of Normandy represented more than territory. It undermined English strategic depth and severed the communications that had allowed them to reinforce and provision their holdings. English commanders like John Talbot fought desperately to hold what they could, achieving tactical successes at times, but strategic defeat loomed larger with each lost port and castle. Normandy's recovery by France symbolized a reversal of fortunes that the English crown could not easily reverse given its domestic constraints. Following Normandy, the crisis concentrated upon Gascony and the vital city of Bordeaux, an economic hub whose wine trade had funded much of the English presence in the region. From the early 1450s, the French campaign in the south intensified, combining military pressure with political efforts to fragment English loyalties. The capture of Bordeaux in 1451 after a mix of siege action and internal betrayal was a devastating blow, cutting off the financial lifeline that the English had relied upon for decades. Attempts to recover Bordeaux culminated in the fateful campaign of 1453, led by Talbot and other determined English commanders, but this last push could not turn back the tide of a resurgent and better-equipped French monarchy. The Battle of Castillon on July 17, 1453, is often cited as the effective end of the 100 Years' War, for it marked the decisive defeat of an English army and the cessation of large-scale English territorial aspirations in France. The French deployment of field artillery at Castillon, prepared in emplacements and used with lethal effect against English positions, showcased the new face of warfare. Talbot, who had become emblematic of English resistance, was killed in the engagement, and his death seemed to close an era of chivalric confrontation that had dominated much of the conflict. After Castillon, English kings hoped only to retain a shadow of their former possessions, the most stubborn of which was Calais, held since 1347 but increasingly an anomaly rather than the nucleus of a continental kingdom. Calais itself deserves attention because its retention complicates any simple declaration that England lost everything in 1453. The town remained in English hands and served as a strategic bridgehead across the Channel, a base for trade, intelligence, and occasional raids. Its preservation into the 16th century reflected the pragmatic recognition that full withdrawal from the continent would have greater costs than holding a small, fortified outpost. Yet Calais was also a hollow victory. It was never the same as ruling vast swathes of French countryside, and its eventual loss in 1558 underlined the long-term unsustainability of an insular default position. The collapse of English power in France was thus not merely a military failure but also an institutional one. England's political system in the mid-15th century was brittle, with rival nobles, weak royal authority, and financial exhaustion combining to produce dysfunction. The wars were expensive, and the mechanisms for raising funds, taxation, loans, the sale of offices, became exhausted and resented. Parliament's increasing impatience with kings who could not secure tangible victories at home or abroad helped to erode the consensus needed for sustained military campaigns, and that erosion would later feed into domestic conflict. The domestic consequences in England were profound. The loss of French territories removed a significant outlet for ambitious nobles and a shared external enemy that had held domestic factions together. With the battlefield gone, competition for power turned inward, sharpening rivalries and creating new cycles of vendetta that culminated in the Wars of the Roses. This internecine conflict, pitting Yorkists against Lancastrians, partly stemmed from the weakened prestige of the monarchy and the vacuum created by the failed foreign policy. Rather than channeling martial energies across the Channel, English arms were turned toward internal reordering, a transition that changed the nature of power struggles in late medieval England. Financial exhaustion was a central component of the collapse. Financing armies, paying soldiers, buying supplies, and keeping garrisons afloat required a steady stream of revenue that the English crown could no longer guarantee. The loss of income from Gascony and other French territories, combined with the expense of maintaining claims and legal fictions, left the crown perpetually short of cash. In practice, this meant unpaid soldiers, cutbacks in military capability, and a reliance on mercenary bands whose loyalty could not always be assured. The crown's precarious finances diminished its bargaining power and made diplomacy a weaker tool for recovering lost ground. Diplomacy itself changed character as the war wound down. The old cycles of chevauchée, siege, and pitched battle gave way to negotiations and local pacts, but these were often built on shaky foundations. The French monarchy's growing administrative competence, centered on royal finances and the management of justice, allowed Charles VII to offer survivable terms that allowed nobles to switch sides without losing face. Meanwhile, English chicanery, mismanagement, and the inability to project a coherent policy transformed negotiation into a stalling tactic rather than a strategic instrument. The result was a French consolidation of power and a diplomatic isolation for England that hastened territorial contraction. The social costs of the conflict's end were substantial and varied. Years of war had displaced populations, disrupted agriculture, and altered patterns of settlement and land use in large parts of France. Nobles who had once expected to profit from war found themselves indebted and landless, while peasant communities bore the brunt of taxation and conscription. In England, veterans returned to a society that had changed and could not easily absorb their numbers, contributing to social unrest and criminality. The long-term demographic impact fed into transformations in labor relations and contributed to the weakening of older feudal bonds. Military culture itself was reshaped by the experience of the 100 Years' War. The prominence of the English longbow in early victories, followed by the later dominance of gunpowder artillery for the French, illustrates a rapid technological and tactical evolution. The old ideal of the armored knight, decisive in single combat and tournament glory, found itself overshadowed by mass infantry tactics and increasingly effective ranged weapons. Armies became professionalized to a degree, with paid infantry and artillery specialists replacing a pure reliance on feudal levies. This shift eroded the social centrality of mounted nobility and redistributed military prestige across a broader slice of society. The psychology of loss played a nuanced role in English identity after the war. For many, the dream of a dual Anglo-French monarchy had been a cultural aspiration, a medieval imagination of greatness. Losing that dream prompted an inward turn, a reimagining of Englishness that emphasized insular institutions, language, and law. Paradoxically, the loss helped crystallize a nascent national consciousness in both countries, each defining itself against the other in language, law, and narrative. Where once cross-channel aristocratic identities were common, the late 15th century saw the hardening of separations that would later underpin modern nationalism. Legal and administrative changes followed hard on the heels of political shifts. In France, the restoration and strengthening of royal courts, the extension of fiscal control, and efforts to integrate local institutions into a more coherent state apparatus created the rudiments of modern governance. In England, the interruption of foreign expansion made domestic matters loom larger, prompting reforms in administration and a reassertion of parliamentary authority. The war's end thus fostered institutional centralization in France and a renewed focus on constitutional development in England, each aligning the two nations toward different models of statecraft. The economic aftermath was complex and uneven. The French recovery required rebuilding infrastructure, reviving trade, and re-establishing agricultural productivity in war-torn regions, tasks that the monarchy approached with varying degrees of success. Commerce gradually resumed, and royal policies incentivized recovery, though the scars of 2 generations of conflict were slow to heal. England's economy, while spared the worst physical devastation of continental theaters, suffered indirectly through the loss of lucrative trade connections, shifts in the wool market, and the cost of maintaining fortresses and garrisons that no longer served a comprehensive strategic vision. Cultural memory of the war left deep imprints on literature, art, and local custom. Chronicles and poems recorded victories and defeats, sometimes with a propagandistic slant, and these narratives shaped how later generations understood the conflict. In France, the glorification of figures like Joan of Arc became central to a national mythology about divine favor and resistance, narratives that kings and men of letters would reuse to legitimize monarchical authority. In England, the remembrance of Agincourt and other early glories remained powerful even as the reality of loss settled in, lending a bittersweet tone to English historical imagination. The human toll is not to be understated. Countless soldiers, civilians, and children perished or were displaced during the intermittent campaigns and sieges that stretched for generations. Disease accompanied armies and convoys, and famine sometimes followed the scorched earth tactics that both sides employed. Families were broken, inheritance claims muddied, and the social fabric of border regions in particular was torn. The final years of the war, while less conventionally dramatic than earlier flurries of battle, consolidated these accumulated tragedies into a weary, persistent decline in life and labor across contested territories. The role of mercenaries and military entrepreneurs became prominent in the war's last stages and in its immediate aftermath. As royal resources shrank, both English and French commanders increasingly relied on contracted soldiers, whose loyalties were more transactional than feudal. These bands could be effective, brutal, and unpredictable, sometimes holding territories but often pillaging countryside when pay lagged. The presence of such forces made the restoration of civil order in reconquered areas more difficult, requiring careful royal oversight and the gradual reassertion of law. Religious institutions were both victims and agents of change during the collapse of English power. Monasteries and churches suffered material losses from pillage and requisitioning, but also played key roles in local recovery, offering charity and shelter when secular governance was absent. Clerics often mediated between different local powers, using their moral authority to stabilize communities and help rebuild trust. The Church's own internal reform movements, motivated by both spiritual and political concerns, intersected with the aftermath of war by advocating better discipline and support for the laity. The international dimension of the war's end extended beyond England and France to involve Burgundy, Scotland, Castile, and the papacy, among others. The Burgundian alliance, which had significantly affected the course of the war, shifted over time and eventually reconciled with France in ways that undermined English ambitions. Scotland remained a traditional ally of France and an intermittent thorn in England's side, while Castile and other Iberian powers were drawn into alliances and maritime interests that shaped long-term European geopolitics. The papacy's role as a mediator or moral arbiter had limited practical success but remained important in terms of legitimacy and moral posture. Marriage alliances, treaties, and dynastic claims that had once underpinned English aspirations for a Franco-English monarchy became less tenable as political realities hardened. The legalistic arguments for English claims to the French crown, sophisticated in their medieval jurisprudence, could not compensate for the practical need to hold land and govern. Over time, these claims receded into diplomatic formality and legal fiction, placeholders for a dream that the changing map, armies, and politics had rendered obsolete. England's retreat from continental pretensions was therefore as much a recognition of pragmatic limits as a consequence of battlefield defeats. The end of the war also contributed to linguistic shifts. In England, the use of English in officialdom and literature, once overshadowed by French and Latin, gained traction as the nation turned inward and national identity became more pronounced. The erosion of Norman French aristocratic fusion hastened a broader cultural anglicization, evident in law courts, administration, and the literary flowering that would come to maturity in the late 15th and 16th centuries. In France, the consolidation of royal power promoted the use of vernacular languages in administration and reinforcement of imperial rhetoric that prized French identity alongside dynastic legitimacy. Memory and memorialization took diverse forms. Monuments, chronicles, and oral traditions preserved the stories of triumph and tragedy, but memory was selective and served political needs. Kingship in both realms reworked the past, elevating narratives that supported their claims and erasing or marginalizing inconvenient truths. Joan of Arc, to take one example, would be canonized in cultural memory and used as a symbol of national restoration, while English defeats came to be framed as episodes of misfortune rather than as definitive rebukes. The legal fallout of lost territories involved complex questions of property, rights, and citizenship for subjects who found themselves on the wrong side of a resurgent border. Nobles who had held lands under English overlordship faced decisions about swearing allegiance to a new sovereign or abandoning ancestral estates. For many, allegiance was pragmatic. Feudal oaths were negotiated, renegotiated, and sometimes annulled in exchange for confirming charters and local privileges. These transactions reshaped landholding patterns and recast local elites into new political relations with the French crown. Popular culture adapted to the new realities with ballads, plays, and stories that absorbed the war into everyday life, sometimes romanticizing, sometimes lamenting. In England, the legend of Agincourt became a moral tale about the courage of common soldiers and the fickleness of royal fortune. In France, epics and local commemorations celebrated the liberation of towns and the divine sanction of the Valois Restoration. These cultural artifacts were not mere nostalgia, they helped communities process trauma and provided frameworks for understanding the transformation of their political world. The fall of English power also had long-term economic implications across the Channel. Every lost port or vineyard reduced customs revenue and trade routes that English merchants had come to depend on. The redirection of trade and the consolidation of markets under French control changed commercial patterns and encouraged maritime investments in other directions. English merchants, deprived of easy access to continental markets, gradually turned toward a stronger maritime orientation, investments in fishing and shipping, and eventually toward the Atlantic trade that would define later centuries. Education and the transmission of knowledge were affected as well. Universities, monastic schools, and local patrons experienced disruption in their operations in war-affected regions. Yet they also became loci for state building by training administrators and lawyers who would staff the revived royal bureaucracy. French institutions, often spared the full brunt of warfare in the later phases, benefited from royal attention and funding as Charles VII and his successors sought to institutionalize governance. In England, intellectual life adapted to the inward gaze, producing scholars and clerics who engaged with matters of law, governance, and the moral questions raised by protracted conflict. The tactical lessons learned by commanders on both sides fed into a broader military revolution of the late medieval period. The integration of artillery, the increasing reliance on professional infantry, and the improved logistics of supply lines signaled a departure from older patterns of mounted warfare. Fortification design changed in response to gunpowder, with thicker, lower walls and angled bastions beginning to replace high curtain walls vulnerable to cannon. These transformations would have reverberations far beyond the local theater, influencing warfare across Europe for generations. Political legitimacy, always a fragile commodity in medieval kingship, emerged as the decisive factor in many local decisions to accept or resist the changing sovereign. Charles VII's emphasis on coronation and legal continuity helped to sway nobles who might otherwise have clung to English patronage. The symbolic act of being crowned at Rheims, and the rituals surrounding sovereignty, mattered as much as sword and plunder in convincing populations to accept a new political reality. Legitimacy thus became a currency as powerful as coin in the reconstruction of France. The long shadow of social mobility cast by the war had mixed outcomes. Some lower-born individuals rose through military or administrative service to gain wealth and status, while a broader trend toward centralization reduced the autonomy of lesser lords. The combination of social upheaval and war-induced vacancies in landholding created openings for enterprising townsmen and clerics to expand influence. Over time, this contributed to a slowly shifting social hierarchy where merit, bureaucratic service, and money competed with lineage in determining a person's prospects. The psychological effect on soldiers who had fought across decades cannot be overstated. Veterans who had borne witness to sieges, massacres, and the slow grind of attrition returned with experiences that were difficult to integrate into peaceful civilian life. Many struggled with physical disability from wounds. Others carried the scars of trauma and the moral burden of acts committed under orders. Communities that accepted these men had to find ways to reintegrate them without the social scaffolding that had earlier been provided by continuing military campaigns. The collapse of English power had consequences for maritime strategy as well. With fewer continental holdings to supply and defend, English naval thinking increasingly allowed for a focus on protecting trade routes and asserting control over the Channel. Port towns like Calais remained crucial for a time, but the strategic calculus shifted gradually toward protecting island resources and sea lanes. This redirection would, in the long run, propel England toward ventures that extended beyond Europe, setting the stage for future imperial expansion. Environmental consequences of sustained warfare are often overlooked, but they matter. Fields left fallow, orchards cut, and rivers forded by marching columns altered local ecosystems. Forests were often exploited for building ships and fortifications, while cattle drives and requisitions changed patterns of grazing. Though the land recovered in many places with careful stewardship, the immediate environmental stress added another layer of hardship for populations living through the war's concluding phases. The role of the nobility changed as the English retreat continued. Some nobles adapted by converting military skills into administrative roles or aligning with the new centers of power in France, while others clung to old identities of martial honor and cross-channel lordship. In England, the waning of overseas ambitions forced many to reconsider their social strategies, and the emerging Tudor dynasty would later capitalize on this by offering new avenues for service and patronage. The transformation was both personal and structural, reorienting elite expectations about power and patronage. The historiography of the war's end has shifted over centuries, reflecting the concerns of those who wrote about it. Contemporary chroniclers often peopled their narratives with moral judgments about kings and commanders, while later historians have emphasized economic and structural factors in the collapse of English power. Modern scholarship tends to approach the end of the 100 Years' War as a set of interlocking phenomena: military innovation, financial exhaustion, political fragmentation, rather than a simple narrative of victory and defeat. This analytical evolution reminds us that history is not static. Our interpretations change as new evidence and new questions reshape the past. One cannot ignore the emotional narratives embedded in the fall of English dominion, the despair of communities that saw garrisons withdraw, the relief of peasants freed from the yoke of billeting soldiers, and the weary resignation of townsfolk who simply wanted to trade and farm in peace. Emotion shaped decisions as much as strategy. Fear could make a garrison abandon a town, while hope could prompt a villain to risk an oath to a new lord. The human element animates the more abstract forces at work, reminding us that at the core of geopolitical shifts are the day-to-day choices of individuals. In the larger sweep of European history, the conclusion of the Hundred Years' War signaled a shift from feudal, dynastic conflict towards centralized nation-states increasingly defined by territorial integrity and bureaucratic control. France emerged on a path toward strong royal administration and court-centered politics, while England, after its reverberating civil wars, moved toward consolidation under the Tudors. Both countries learned, often painfully, that old medieval conceptions of overlapping authority and personal lordship were being replaced by new ideas about sovereign rule and the responsibilities of government to maintain order and finance. The end of the war altered the balance of noble identities in the Atlantic theater. Maritime power began to claim more strategic importance, and seafaring towns developed a new prominence in political and economic life. As continental ambitions dwindled for England, attention shifted toward naval strength, exploration, and commerce, prefiguring the maritime imperialism that would characterize later centuries. The seeds of future expansions, pulled partly from the necessities created by defeat, were quietly sown in the rubble of lost forts and empty castles. The legal mechanisms for peace and property settlement were complicated but crucial to the post-war order. Treaties, local lords' agreements, royal pardons, and the reconfirmation of rights were all tools used to stabilize regions after they were retaken by France. These legal acts were not just paperwork, they were essentials for rebuilding trust, re-establishing market rules, and ensuring that tax revenues and services could be collected. For many communities, the return to normalcy hinged on the reliability of these instruments and the integrity of those who administered them. The psychological need for narratives of continuity and legitimate rule explains much of Charles VII's success. By reasserting crown prerogatives and focusing on the ritual and legal accoutrements of monarchy, he provided a sense of restored normality that war-weary populations welcomed. Coronation rituals, the distribution of royal justice, and the affirmation of property rights all helped to normalize the transition from fractured authority to centralized monarchy. People looked for familiar anchors in the storm, and the ritual of sovereign rule provided them. The collapse of English power also left a complicated legacy regarding colonial mentality and the imagination of empire. For centuries, English kings had dreamed of holding France as part of a trans-channel dominion, imagining a territorial empire in Europe akin to those they would later seek overseas. The failure of this dream forced a conceptual pivot. If empire could not be stitched across the channel, perhaps it could be sought across oceans. This reorientation did not happen overnight, but the mental reorganization from continental to maritime ambition can be traced back to the late medieval disappointments. As the last English strongholds fell, everyday life for ordinary people slowly regained a measure of predictability. Markets reopened, harvests recovered, and local governance took hold. Yet recovery was uneven. Some regions remained scarred for generations, and memories of occupation, pillage, and betrayal lingered. The end of formal hostilities did not immediately erase the war's social consequences, but it did provide the crucial space for repair, rebuilding, and reimagination. Calais, small as it was compared to the lost provinces, served as a constant in the story of English persistence and eventual retreat. For more than a century after 1453, it remained an English outpost, a reminder of the past and a logistical hub for trade and military action. Its retention was emblematic of a half-measure policy. England could not reassert what it had lost, but it would not entirely cede its foothold in continental affairs either. The mixed symbolism of Calais reflected the broader ambiguity of an island power no longer dominant on the mainland but still unwilling to accept total relinquishment. The conclusion of the 100 Years' War also affected the morale and prestige of the chivalric class. Many knights who had expected honor and wealth from foreign campaigns found themselves without adequate rewards and without the theaters where martial reputations had once been built. The decline of chivalry as an organizing social ideal left a cultural vacuum that would be filled by new courtly codes and an increasing appreciation for administrative skill. Honor persisted as a value, but its expression evolved from battlefield prowess to court influence and bureaucratic competence. The impact on the arts and architecture was paradoxical. On the one hand, the devastation of the war curtailed patronage and construction in many regions, while on the other, the need to commemorate and rebuild inspired commissions that celebrated renewal. Churches were rebuilt, civic halls restored, and new works of patronage celebrated the reconsolidation of royal power. The mixture of mourning and aspiration that characterized post-war commissions reveals how art served both as an act of remembrance and as a tool of political legitimation. Women bore unique burdens and played central roles in the transition from war to peace. Noble women often managed estates in the absence of husbands or sons, making crucial decisions about defense, finance, and loyalty. Peasant women labored to keep households functioning under the strain of requisitions and taxes, and they sometimes took part in local defense or negotiation when men were absent. The war's end brought no instant relief, but the altered responsibilities and experiences of women in wartime left lasting marks on social relations. The courtly culture that reemerged after the war was different in tone, more bureaucratic and less exclusively martial. Royal courts became centers of administration where legal disputes were resolved, and monarchical authority was performed through ceremony and the dispensation of favors. This shift reflected the broader transformation from an aristocratic culture dominated by battlefield aristocracy to one in which administrative competence and proximity to the royal center were crucial. The court was no longer just a theater for chivalric display but the engine of governance and social mobility. Military architecture and the geography of defense shifted in response to new weapons and tactics. Towns and castles adopted lower, thicker walls, gun platforms, and earthworks to withstand cannon fire. Defensive thinking moved from an emphasis on vertical height to strategic dispersion and fields of fire, with bastion-like constructions and coordinated artillery emplacements becoming increasingly common. These changes were pragmatic responses to the experiences of sieges and bombardment that had characterized the war's final decades. The end of the 100 Years' War produced an ambiguous peace, not a neat settlement. The legal claims lingered, old titles persisted, and cultural memory held onto both victory and defeat. The conflict did not vanish overnight, but its embers cooled in the face of new political realities. For both countries, the cessation of permanent, warlike engagement allowed attention to shift inward, toward reform, reconstruction, and consolidation. The centuries that followed owe much of their political map to the slow, grinding closure of this medieval struggle. Trade networks gradually reknit themselves after the cessation of sustained hostilities, but the pattern of trade changed. Merchants adjusted, redirected, and innovated in response to new political borders, finding alternative markets and channels. Cities that had been sites of conflict reinvented themselves as centers of local commerce, while seaside towns refocused on maritime trade. The reconstruction of commercial life was incremental, reliant on local initiative and the broader stability provided by stronger monarchies. The psychological transition away from a culture of endless military campaigning also had effects on legal and social norms. Societies that had grown used to extraordinary measures during wartime had to reestablish regular legal processes and peacetime norms. Restoring trust between communities and kingship required patience and policy, including pardons, restitution, and the reestablishment of fair taxation. The restoration of routine became itself a political project, central to the reassertion of sovereignty and the return to productive life. The closing chapters of the Hundred Years' War left the English nobility more inward-looking and more dependent on domestic legal frameworks. Land disputes, inheritance battles, and local rivalries required mediation by a crown that could no longer distract rivals with continental service. The resulting intensification of domestic politics created both space for parliamentary growth and the combustible tensions that would later fuel civil war. The end of continental empire was, in this sense, a catalyst for the centralization and politicization of English authority. In France, the consolidation of territorial control enabled the monarchy to increase the taxation base and invest in institutions that promoted effective governance. Royal revenues, while never secure, grew more predictable as a result of stable rule and the management of reclaimed lands. This newfound fiscal confidence underwrote further military reforms and diplomatic initiatives that would secure France's position in succeeding decades. In other words, the end of the war was not merely a closing of accounts, it was the opening of a new political economy for the kingdom. Beyond the immediate political consequences, the end of the Hundred Years' War had a profound influence on the psychology of European rulers. The realization that prolonged dynastic warfare could drain resources and leave both victor and vanquished weakened led to a greater appetite for diplomacy, marriage alliances, and legal claims rather than endless military pursuit. This cautious recalibration helped shape a late medieval and early modern world in which diplomacy and statecraft slowly matured into systematic forms of international relations. The lessons of exhaustion were institutionalized into new approaches to conflict. The last generation to have lived through the full arc of the Hundred Years' War carried the memory into early modern politics and culture. Veterans, chroniclers, and civic leaders who had seen towns conquered and reoccupied became active participants in the post-war settlement, applying lessons learned in negotiation, defense, and communal resilience. Their experiences helped forge a political memory that emphasized restoration, continuity, and the dangers of overreach. Thus, the end of the war resonated well beyond the battlefield into the social fabric of subsequent centuries. Religious and moral interpretations of the war's end varied widely. Some saw divine providence favoring one house over another, while others interpreted the long years of suffering as a test of Christian charity and governance. Clerics and theologians debated the rights and wrongs of war, the moral implications of ransom and pillage, and the obligations of kings to care for their subjects. These debates influenced political rhetoric in the ways rulers justified their actions in a world where moral authority remained a key component of legitimacy. Finally, the legacy of the Hundred Years' War's end is a story of transformation more than of simple triumph or defeat. England emerged diminished on the continent yet pushed toward a maritime destiny that would alter global history. France, having reclaimed its territories, consolidated into a more centralized state that would become a cornerstone of European power. The collapse of English continental power and the lasting legacy of these changes shaped not only the immediate region but the broader trajectory of Europe, seeding innovations in governance, warfare, and identity that would echo through the modern age. Smash subscribe to join the story of how Europe was rebuilt after endless war. Comment, I sail with England, or I stand with France.